Across the most isolated research stations on Earth, moments of quiet observation have been interrupted by events that left no clear explanation behind. Instruments failed without warning, transmissions vanished mid-recording, and data meant to define the environment instead exposed its limits, forcing researchers to confront gaps that careful methodology could not close. Within these stations, beneath polar ice, inside desert observatories, and across remote monitoring posts, you will encounter equipment malfunctions that resisted repair, anomalous readings that could not be reconciled, and subtle signs of phenomena documented only in fragments. Each account centers on a real location and a real mission, revealing how controlled scientific environments can still produce mysteries that remain unresolved long after the stations themselves fall silent. The unlogged voices beneath Lake Vostok. Beneath nearly 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, Lake Vostok exists as one of the most isolated bodies of water on Earth, sealed away from sunlight, atmosphere, and surface life for an estimated 15 million years. The Russian research station constructed above it was intended to observe this hidden environment through indirect means, relying on instruments rather than direct access. Yet, over time, the station became associated with an unsettling anomaly, unexplained acoustic signals detected during subsurface monitoring that were never formally logged, published, or addressed in official reports. The incident surfaced quietly, without alarm, and then faded into silence. Lake Vostok is not a fringe theory or speculative discovery. Its existence was confirmed in the 1970s through airborne radar surveys conducted during Soviet Antarctic expeditions, revealing a vast subglacial lake measuring roughly 250 kilometers in length and up to 50 kilometers wide. The ice sheet above it reaches depths exceeding 3,700 meters, exerting immense pressure while insulating the water below from surface conditions. Temperatures at Vostok Station routinely fall below -60 degrees Celsius, making it one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. Every observation of the lake depended entirely on remote sensing and indirect measurement. The station's monitoring systems included seismic instruments, pressure sensors, and hydroacoustic equipment designed to detect ice movement and subsurface changes. These instruments were calibrated to distinguish between natural ice deformation, mechanical noise, and environmental interference. During extended winter periods, when drilling operations were paused and surface activity slowed to a minimum, some technicians reported detecting acoustic patterns that did not match known categories. These signals were not violent or chaotic like icequakes, nor continuous like mechanical feedback. Instead, they appeared intermittent, structured, and difficult to classify. Official scientific publications from the Russian Antarctic program do not reference these acoustic irregularities. However, mentions of unexplained signals appear indirectly in secondary discussions, conference remarks, and retrospective commentary by researchers familiar with Vostok's operational history. The lack of formal acknowledgement does not mean the data never existed. Rather, it suggests that the signals were deemed unsuitable for publication, possibly categorized as interference or dismissed internally without further investigation. In a tightly controlled research environment, exclusion from the record often meant permanent disappearance. Information surrounding Lake Vostok has always been managed with unusual caution. International concern intensified in the 1990s and early 2000s over the potential contamination of the lake during drilling attempts, leading to delays, redesigns, and diplomatic scrutiny. Any anomaly associated with the lake risked complicating an already sensitive scientific effort. Within that context, unexplained acoustic data may have been considered an unnecessary complication, particularly if it resisted explanation using existing glaciological models. What distinguished the reported signals from ordinary background noise was their apparent regularity. Natural ice sounds tend to be abrupt, irregular, and linked to identifiable stress events within the ice sheet. The signals detected beneath Vostok, according to those who later referenced them, did not conform to this pattern. They appeared at intervals, sometimes during periods of operational inactivity, and did not correlate with drilling depth changes or known seismic events. Without raw data, these descriptions remain incomplete, yet their recurrence across monitoring sessions raised quite concern. The physical environment beneath Lake Vostok adds another layer of uncertainty. The lake is believed to interact with geothermal heat from Earth's crust, and pressure conditions at depth differ dramatically from surface ice dynamics. While these factors could produce unfamiliar acoustic effects, no verified mechanism has been proposed that would generate sustained, patterned signals of the type described. The absence of a theoretical explanation did not lead to further inquiry. Instead, the phenomenon was allowed to drift outside the boundaries of formal study. The extreme isolation of Vostok Station complicates interpretation further. Crews are cut off from the outside world for months at a time, with no evacuation possible during winter. Psychological stress, sensory deprivation and fatigue are well-documented challenges, and skeptics have suggested that human perception could have influenced interpretations of ambiguous data. This explanation weakens, however, when considering that the anomalies were reportedly detected through instruments rather than direct auditory experience. Instrument-based signals demand technical explanations, not subjective ones. In 2012, Russian scientists announced that they had successfully reached Lake Vostok's surface waters after decades of preparation. The achievement was framed as a triumph of engineering and restraint, with press coverage focused on sterile drilling techniques and the potential discovery of ancient microbial life. Data releases emphasized ice core chemistry and pressure dynamics. Conspicuously absent was any discussion of earlier unexplained acoustic readings. If the signals had been resolved or dismissed conclusively, their omission would seem unnecessary. Occasional remarks by former expedition members hint at unresolved data irregularities during Vostok operations, though always in vague terms. These comments are typically framed as operational difficulties rather than discoveries worthy of analysis. In a scientific culture defined by documentation, redundancy and traceability, the absence of detailed logs, timestamps or archived recordings stands out. Something was detected, acknowledged internally, and then quietly removed from the permanent scientific record. Today, Lake Vostok remains one of Earth's most carefully controlled research environments. Its waters still largely unexplored, and its monitoring data selectively released. Advances in subglacial science have not clarified what was recorded during those early years, and no effort has been made to revisit the anomaly with modern tools. Without access to the original recordings or internal reports, the signals cannot be evaluated, dismissed, or understood. The mystery persists not because evidence was lacking, but because it was never allowed to speak for itself. Whatever passed through the instruments beneath Lake Vostok was noticed long enough to unsettle those monitoring it, and silenced long enough to remain unexplained. The Halley Research Station winter evacuation. The Brunt ice shelf is never still, even when it appears frozen into silence. Layers of compacted snow and ancient ice creep imperceptibly outward, carving fissures that deepen with every seasonal shift. Halley Research Station, perched atop this shifting platform, was designed to accommodate motion through hydraulic legs and modular structures, yet even the most advanced engineering could not render the shelf entirely predictable. During the austral winter, when the sun disappears for months, the station becomes an isolated outpost against a frozen horizon, and in one particularly harsh season, it would become the stage for an unprecedented evacuation that defied Antarctic convention. Halley Research Station was engineered with the expectation that the ground beneath it would eventually fail, a reality mitigated by its ski-mounted modules capable of gradual relocation. This design allowed scientists and engineers to adapt to crevasses, snow accumulation, and structural stress, a feature few other Antarctic bases could claim. The station's architecture was simultaneously fragile and resilient, emphasizing mobility over permanence, yet it was also intended to keep life safe even when storms or ice shifts threatened. Engineers monitored these systems continuously, logging every adjustment and recalibration, aware that the smallest misalignment in winter could escalate into a life-threatening situation. Public explanations described the evacuation as a measured response to growing fractures in the surrounding ice. Official statements referenced ice movements and the appearance of widening crevasses, suggesting that preemptive relocation was necessary to preserve personnel and equipment. News coverage framed the event as procedural, a reminder that Antarctica's environment is unforgiving and that Halley's design could not negate its inherent dangers. The station's modular nature made the move technically feasible, but the decision remained extraordinary. Winter evacuations were virtually unheard of, reserved only for catastrophic conditions that, in this case, were never fully quantified for the public record. What remained absent from those explanations were the specific thresholds that transformed long-term risk into immediate retreat. Internal reports, if they exist, have not been released, leaving researchers and historians to speculate on the exact measurements of ice displacement, pressure, or structural compromise that prompted the decision. Those thresholds, typically rigidly defined in Antarctic operations, were apparently crossed without clear documentation. For anyone outside the station, the evacuation remains enigmatic. A well-trained, well-equipped team abandoned their post not in response to visible calamity, but to an invisible line that no one has confirmed, archived, or shared. A winter evacuation in Antarctica is not a logistical inconvenience, but a scenario most stations are designed to avoid entirely. Extreme cold, months of darkness, and unpredictable weather create conditions where movement of people and equipment is inherently dangerous. Aircraft cannot always reach the continent, and overland traversal across ice crevasses can be fatal. Evacuating Halley required precise coordination, meticulous packing of essential supplies, and constant monitoring of ice stability, all while operating under near-total darkness. The decision to leave was not impulsive. It was a measure of last resort taken in a season when every choice carried heightened risk. Inside the station, daily life during the polar night depended on routines that assumed structural stability and isolation would remain manageable. Scientists conducted atmospheric studies, glaciology research, and environmental monitoring under conditions of extreme monotony, punctuated only by storms that made movement outdoors impossible. Heating, water, and electricity were carefully rationed, with redundancies in place to survive weeks without external support. Yet, in the weeks leading up to the evacuation, these routines were increasingly disrupted by structural stresses, shifting floors and subtle noises transmitted through the modular legs, hinting at instability that official reports would not elaborate on, and raising unease among the crew. When the decision was finally executed, Halley was not destroyed, dismantled, or publicly condemned as unsafe. The station's modules were carefully secured, instruments packed, and the crew transported to more stable bases along the coast. Despite the complexity and danger, no catastrophic event occurred, and the evacuation passed without loss of life. Yet the very fact that it was deemed necessary during the harshest winter months and that details were sparse gave the event a quiet, persistent mystery. The absence of elaboration in the scientific record leaves the station frozen not only physically on the ice shelf, but also within the archives of Antarctic operations. Later scientific papers referenced the evacuation only in passing, as though it were an administrative footnote rather than a rupture in protocol. Analyses of ice shelf movement, climate modelling, and station design focused on broader patterns, never returning to the precise circumstances that compelled the winter departure. Interviews with personnel have been cautious, with individuals emphasising professional discretion and adherence to safety protocols, without elaborating on the factors that made evacuation unavoidable. This selective recounting magnifies the sense of opacity, giving the event a shadowed significance despite its documented procedural execution. The unanswered question is not whether the ice shelf was changing, but why accepted margins of safety suddenly ceased to apply. Halley's engineering was intended to absorb stress, yet the sequence of events demonstrates that even advanced design cannot anticipate every variable in an environment shaped by constant motion and extreme weather. The precise combination of environmental, structural, and operational pressures that led to the unprecedented evacuation remains unpublished. For outsiders, the station's winter departure is a tangible mystery, a human response to forces that are simultaneously measurable, yet never fully disclosed. Long after the last personnel departed, monitoring continued on an empty structure exposed to forces no longer openly discussed. Sensors recorded the slow creep of ice beneath the foundations, the subtle tilt of modules, and the shifting pattern of crevasses encroaching on previously stable ground. These readings exist largely outside the public record, and though they may confirm environmental strain, they do not explain the timing, thresholds, or decision-making process behind the evacuation. Halley remains intact yet eerily silent, a station abandoned not by accident but by necessity, whose details were deliberately left obscure. The station stood abandoned beneath endless night, its silence guarding questions that no official report would ever answer. the South Pole Telescope Data Blackout. A sudden gap appeared in the telescope's continuous stream, leaving months of celestial observation unaccounted for. Staff at the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station first noticed the discrepancy when routine checks revealed missing log files and unrecorded measurements. The telescope, designed to monitor faint variations in the cosmic microwave background, relies on uninterrupted data to maintain its calibration and contribute to long-term astrophysical studies. Months of observations vanished from servers, leaving gaps in records that are usually meticulous and redundant. Scientists immediately understood the significance. In a facility built for precision, nothing is ever supposed to disappear without explanation. The South Pole Telescope sits atop the Amundsen-Scott Station, where extreme cold and high altitude test both machinery and human endurance. Temperatures routinely drop below -70 degrees Celsius, and the air at 2,835 meters above sea level is thin and dry, conditions that strain electronics and complicate maintenance. The telescope's massive dish, precisely balanced and insulated, is designed to operate in near-perfect stability, despite these environmental extremes. Any sudden failure in data transmission or storage is magnified by the station's remoteness, where technicians cannot simply reach a warehouse to replace hardware, and every repair must be meticulously planned around weather and logistics. Its instruments are designed to record faint cosmic signals over long periods, each observation building on years of precise calibration. Scientists rely on these measurements to map the subtle fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background, which inform theories about the universe's origins and evolution. Even small gaps can undermine months of data, introducing uncertainties that ripple through research worldwide. The South Pole Telescope's power systems, cryogenic cooling mechanisms, and networked computers are calibrated to avoid interruptions, and redundancy is built into every subsystem. Yet, despite these precautions, the missing data represented a breach in a chain meant to be unbroken. When technicians first realized that critical files had vanished, the anomaly was not immediately explainable by weather, hardware, or human error. The loss did not coincide with any known storm or outage, nor was there evidence of physical damage to the instruments or storage arrays. Logs indicated normal operation up until the moment the blackout appeared, making the event both sudden and puzzling. For researchers accustomed to predictability in extreme environments, the situation introduced an uncharacteristic tension. Months of carefully recorded cosmic readings had simply ceased to exist in the official archives. Attempts to restore the system revealed that redundant servers and backup channels had simultaneously failed to preserve the missing datasets. Engineers confirmed that standard failsafes had engaged as expected, yet the backups contained identical gaps. Disk arrays and storage clusters were intact, network connections were functional, and no error messages suggested routine corruption. This simultaneous failure of multiple independent systems contradicted all prior experience at the station, leaving staff with the realization that the anomaly might not have a conventional explanation rooted in technology alone. Remote verification was hampered by limited satellite windows and the inability to physically access the telescope during the austral winter. Communications rely on brief periods when satellites pass over the station, and instruments must be monitored remotely from thousands of kilometers away. Technicians could check system health, power usage, and network integrity, but physical inspection of drives or mechanical components was impossible until the summer season. The constraints introduced a sense of helplessness, as the event unfolded over weeks without the possibility of immediate intervention, leaving unanswered questions to accumulate alongside every lost byte of data. The missing data disrupted not only local analyses, but also international collaborations, where long-term measurements are crucial for interpreting cosmic background patterns. Scientists worldwide rely on these observations to refine models of cosmic inflation and the formation of galactic structures. Entire research proposals and projects were affected by the gaps, and some publications were delayed pending verification. The blackout reminded all involved that even the most advanced instruments are vulnerable, and that in Antarctica, control over observation is never absolute, no matter how precise the technology. Engineers and scientists explored software glitches, corrupted drives, and electromagnetic interference, but none of these fully accounted for the blackout. Each hypothesis was tested methodically, Firmware logs were examined, server processes audited, and environmental data cross-referenced with the timeline of the missing files. None yielded a definitive cause. The redundancy built into the system designed to guard against exactly these contingencies had failed in ways that were neither reproducible nor easily explained. The resulting uncertainty became the dominant feature of the incident, overshadowing technical minutiae with a broader sense of the inexplicable. Staff at the station endured long hours of troubleshooting, logging every procedure while navigating isolation, bitter cold, and the knowledge that critical observations had vanished. Their work extended beyond normal duty cycles, constrained by the circadian distortions of polar night and the necessity to remain vigilant in a physically taxing environment. Psychologically, the combination of monotony, responsibility, and an unsolved problem heightened tension. The missing data, though intangible, carried weight comparable to a physical catastrophe. It represented months of human and technological effort, erased in a manner that was neither visible nor directly attributable to any identifiable event. Despite repeated reviews, the cause of the blackout remained unresolved, leaving both local and global teams with a persistent sense of unanswered questions. Investigations continued over subsequent months, with additional analysis of network logs, hardware performance, and environmental conditions. While some minor contributing factors were identified, none fully explained the event's scope or timing. The missing information now exists as a shadow within the digital record, a period in which the cosmos was being observed, but the observations themselves were lost, leaving only speculation about what, if anything, might have been recorded but cannot be retrieved. A silence now fills the digital archives, where once the cosmos was faithfully recorded, leaving scientists to wonder what vanished before it could be understood. The Siple Station shutdown files. Among the silent corridors of Siple Station, researchers discovered that certain operational logs had vanished without explanation. The files, once routine records of experiments and daily procedures, were suddenly inaccessible or missing entirely. Personnel reviewing archived data noticed gaps in instrument readings, winter experiment logs, and communication transcripts. For a facility built on meticulous documentation, the disappearance was anomalous. Every instrument, from very low frequency VLF receivers to geophysical sensors, was supposed to record data continuously, with backups stored in multiple formats. The absence of these records raised immediate questions about both institutional procedures and the fate of the data themselves. Perched on the remote Antarctic ice, the station functioned in isolation, its instruments continuously recording the invisible rhythms of the upper atmosphere. Situated hundreds of kilometers from any other research outpost, Siple relied on self-contained power, life support, and communication systems. Extreme temperatures, katabatic winds, and shifting snow presented constant hazards for equipment and staff alike. In this environment, consistent record-keeping was both difficult and essential. The station's design prioritized reliability, with careful documentation considered a safeguard against environmental failures. Yet even in these controlled conditions, the missing shutdown files introduced an unexpected uncertainty into the archive, a subtle disruption of the institution's procedural order. The shutdown files contained precise records of experiments, equipment calibrations, and communications during winter months. Each entry meant to safeguard both personnel and data integrity. They documented adjustments to VLF transmitters, power cycles of sensitive receivers, and daily meteorological readings critical for interpreting experimental results. Beyond scientific importance, these logs offered a window into operational safety, revealing how staff adapted to isolation and extreme conditions. Their loss meant that months of procedural detail were no longer verifiable. Without these records, researchers and historians face incomplete accounts of Siple's contributions, with critical information about instrument behaviour and environmental conditions rendered inaccessible. It was only when archival teams attempted to review historical operations that the absence of these records became unmistakable, a conspicuous gap in otherwise meticulous documentation. Routine audits and cross-referencing with satellite communication logs revealed missing entries, inconsistencies in timestamps, and incomplete metadata. For a station renowned for precision, the pattern was unusual. Gaps were neither random nor trivial. They spanned multiple experimental campaigns and winter periods, suggesting that the files were not merely misplaced, but systematically unavailable. The realization unsettled researchers accustomed to complete overlapping archives, and introduced an unsettling sense that the station's operational history was incomplete. Repeated requests to access or verify the missing files met procedural hurdles, as official channels offered little clarity beyond standard administrative explanations. Formal inquiries returned vague references to routine archiving protocols, security classifications, and institutional regulations governing Antarctic research records. Those attempting to follow the paper trail were met with bureaucratic barriers, emphasizing authorized access over transparency. While some data were eventually accessible, the most sensitive or comprehensive shutdown logs remained withheld, leaving a fragmented narrative. The contrast between routine operational clarity and the sudden opacity of these files heightened the sense of mystery surrounding Siple Station's historical record. Technicians and historians considered technical failure, misfiling, and classified projects as potential causes, yet none accounted for the full pattern of omissions. Equipment failure could explain isolated gaps, but redundancy measures and cross-platform backups should have preserved the files. Misfiling seemed improbable given the station's archival rigor and protocol. Speculation about classified or restricted projects offered a partial explanation, yet documentation typically contains at least minimal traces of sensitive work. The unexplained absence of these shutdown logs remains irregular, resisting simple explanation and leaving investigators to wonder whether the gaps were accidental, intentional, or a combination of both. The gaps complicated interpretation of Siple's long-term experiments, leaving questions about atmospheric phenomena and instrument performance unresolved. Without complete shutdown records, reconstructing the behavior of VLF transmitters, geophysical sensors, and meteorological instruments is difficult. Cross-references with collaborative international datasets can fill some gaps, but inconsistencies remain. Researchers attempting to model historical ionospheric activity or calibrate instruments against environmental conditions face uncertainty. This uncertainty extends beyond the station itself, influencing broader scientific conclusions. The missing files cast a shadow over experiments previously considered fully documented, leaving scholars to navigate both literal and figurative voids in the Antarctic record. Institutional silence persisted, with references to the files appearing only in passing, as if the very existence of missing data were inconvenient to acknowledge. Scientific papers, internal reports, and operational histories rarely elaborate, emphasizing completed research over archival gaps. This deliberate minimalism magnifies the sense of unease. The absence becomes a narrative itself. Each missing log is a reminder that institutional memory can be fragile, even in an environment as controlled as Antarctica. The files, or their lack, silently assert the limits of knowledge and the possibility that some aspects of Siple Station's operations may never be fully reconstructed. Personnel who had worked at the station recalled unusual restrictions on documentation, noting that curiosity was tempered by policy and by the quiet understanding that some records were never meant to be shared. Staff described protocols for logging experiments, transmitting data, and maintaining equipment, but acknowledged that certain shutdown procedures were deliberately excluded from public archives. Their accounts hint at institutional caution, perhaps reflecting concerns over experiment sensitivity or operational safety. Even those with first-hand knowledge could only speculate about the missing file's full contents, reinforcing the idea that in Antarctica some truths are kept quietly beneath layers of ice, bureaucracy, and protocol. Even after repeated investigation, the reasons for the missing files remained elusive, the archival void itself a lingering presence in the history of the station. Scholars and engineers have pieced together partial reconstructions comparing secondary sources, communications, and instrument outputs. Yet the original shutdown logs remain unavailable, their absence shaping both historical interpretation and scientific analysis. The gap is not dramatic, but it is persistent, a quiet reminder that even meticulous systems can leave questions unanswered. In the story of Siple Station, the missing files are as significant as any recorded observation, their silence carrying meaning beyond the content they once held. The files remain out of reach, a quiet testament to questions that will persist long after the station itself has vanished beneath the ice. The Concordia Station Psychological Incident. During the endless polar night, staff at Concordia Station began to notice behaviours that defied routine expectations. Initially subtle, The anomalies appeared in small deviations from schedules and interactions, barely registering against the backdrop of a harsh, isolated environment. Researchers and technicians observed moments of unusual agitation or withdrawal, sometimes in the middle of otherwise calm days. Though the station maintained strict operational protocols, the winter over crew found themselves grappling with changes that could not be easily explained. For a station accustomed to precision and discipline, these irregularities introduced a quiet, unsettling tension that lingered through corridors and communal areas alike. Encased in steel modules atop the Antarctic plateau, the crew experienced months of darkness, extreme cold, and sensory monotony that tested the limits of endurance. Temperatures outside routinely fell below -60 degrees Celsius, while inside limited artificial light and recycled air imposed a stark sense of confinement. Windows looked out onto endless white expanses, offering little visual stimulation, and outside communication was restricted to brief satellite windows. The combination of isolation, environmental monotony, and physical stress created conditions that could exacerbate subtle behavioural changes, making every small action within the station's walls a potential signal of something more significant. The station housed a small team of scientists, engineers, and technicians, each following rigid schedules of experiments, maintenance, and communal responsibilities. Roles were clearly defined, with overlapping duties meant to ensure both safety and continuity of research. Daily routines included monitoring atmospheric instruments, performing VLF and geophysical experiments, logging meteorological conditions, and maintaining life support systems. Structured mealtimes, exercise periods, and leisure hours were incorporated to support mental health, yet even this carefully calibrated schedule could not fully shield the crew from the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and unchanging surroundings. Unusual patterns emerged slowly: subtle mood swings, strained interactions, and isolated withdrawal, sometimes occurring without warning or apparent cause. Crew members would occasionally avoid shared spaces or refrain from verbal exchanges, behaviours inconsistent with their training and prior disposition. Others demonstrated sudden irritability or hyperfocus on tasks, often beyond normal expectations. These changes were neither continuous nor uniform, creating a pattern of unpredictability that puzzled both peers and supervisors. The irregularity of these behaviours heightened unease, as no single cause could be definitively identified, leaving the crew to confront both the environmental extremity and the vulnerability of the human mind. Medical officers and mission psychologists meticulously documented the anomalies through daily logs, structured interviews, and observation of interpersonal dynamics. Every instance of unusual behaviour was noted, including contextual factors such as task load, time of day, and environmental conditions. Logs included both subjective observations and objective measures, such as physiological readings or reported sleep disturbances. Researchers treated each record with scientific rigour, aware that even minor details could prove critical in understanding psychological responses to extreme isolation. Yet, as the records accumulated, the patterns became more perplexing, raising questions about whether the events reflected isolated stress responses or something more enigmatic. Investigators considered familiar stressors: circadian disruption, sensory deprivation, social isolation. But these alone could not account for the intensity and timing of the episodes. Though the crew endured months of continuous darkness and limited daylight exposure, the fluctuations in behaviour did not correspond neatly to known patterns of seasonal affective stress or sleep-wake disruption. Social monotony and enforced proximity created tension, but similar conditions in prior expeditions had not produced comparable anomalies. Each analysis seemed to partially explain one aspect of the behaviour, while leaving others unresolved, reinforcing a sense of mystery that could not be quantified or fully rationalised. Administrators responded cautiously, adjusting work rotations, implementing counselling sessions, and reviewing safety protocols to maintain both research output and crew stability. Measures were taken to ensure that high-priority experiments continued uninterrupted, while also allowing time for personal reflection, group discussion, and mental health support. Staff were advised to monitor peers carefully, yet without overstepping professional boundaries, a delicate balance between oversight and autonomy. Despite these interventions, behavioural irregularities persisted. demonstrating that even deliberate administrative action and structured support could not fully mitigate the psychological stress imposed by extreme Antarctic conditions. Even with thorough documentation and repeated analysis, the underlying causes remained unclear, leaving researchers to confront the unpredictable effects of extreme isolation. Logs and observational data captured every measurable factor, yet failed to account for the subjective experience of the individuals involved. The environment remained constant, routines unchanged, and social structure intact, suggesting that the mystery was not entirely external. Researchers and psychologists acknowledge that human behavior in such extreme conditions contains variables that resist complete observation, leaving a lingering sense of incompleteness that underscores both the fragility and adaptability of the mind. The incident offered insight into human resilience and vulnerability, influencing preparation for future Antarctic missions and long-duration space analogues. Psychological monitoring protocols, mental health support systems, and scheduling practices were revised in subsequent expeditions based on lessons from Concordia. Crew selection emphasized emotional stability and adaptability, while training programs incorporated simulated isolation and sensory monotony. Although the anomaly could not be fully explained, its study provided valuable data for understanding how extreme conditions affect human cognition, social interaction, and operational reliability, revealing the thin line between endurance and psychological strain in the harshest environments on Earth. All recorded observations still fail to reveal the full scope or triggers of the psychological anomaly at Concordia Station, leaving a quiet enigma in the station's history. Researchers, mission planners, and future winter-over crews can examine logs, interviews, and experimental data, yet the human mind's response to isolation remains partially unknowable. The incident endures as a testament to the limits of observation and control in extreme environments, a reminder that even meticulously documented scientific outposts contain mysteries beyond the reach of measurement. Even months after the winter crew returned, the traces of that quiet disturbance lingered, a puzzle embedded in the frozen corridors of Concordia that no record could fully explain. The McMurdo ice tunnel collapse. A low rumble echoed through the ice, followed by a sudden fracture that split the tunnel floor and threw personnel into immediate peril. The sound reverberated along the narrow passageways, a chilling reminder that even carefully engineered structures are vulnerable to the immense forces of Antarctic ice. Crew members scrambled, their movements restricted by cold, debris, and the confined space, while emergency lights flickered against frost-coated walls. The collapse was sudden and unpredictable, leaving staff disoriented and acutely aware of the fragility of their environment. For a station accustomed to operational precision, the event introduced an immediate, palpable tension that lingered long after the initial tremor. These passageways, meticulously reinforced with engineering supports, had long been central to transporting supplies, maintaining utilities, and housing experimental equipment. Carved into solid ice and layered with insulating materials, the tunnels were designed to withstand seasonal expansion, subtle shifts in the ice, and the weight of accumulated snow above. Every beam, brace, and conduit had been positioned according to detailed plans, drawing on decades of Antarctic engineering experience. The passageways were not merely functional, they were lifelines, connecting the station's remote facilities, enabling uninterrupted research and providing a controlled environment amidst one of Earth's harshest climates. Constant shifts in temperature, hidden fissures, and ice expansion applied relentless pressure, challenging the resilience of every tunnel wall and ceiling. The Antarctic plateau experiences dramatic thermal fluctuations, with daytime and nighttime differences compounded by solar exposure variations and the insulating properties of accumulated snow. Ice, while seemingly solid, moves imperceptibly over time, creating stresses that can remain invisible to even the most thorough inspection. Engineers accounted for much of this, but the dynamic nature of ice, combined with the sheer weight of overlying layers, meant that no tunnel could ever be considered entirely immutable or predictable. Monitoring devices tracked stress, microfractures, and environmental fluctuations, but no warning suggested a collapse was imminent or inevitable. Sensors recorded subtle movements in the ice, pressure changes on the structural supports, and minor shifts in temperature, yet none indicated the combination of factors that would soon trigger failure. The data logs offered reassurance but could not capture the hidden, cumulative stresses building silently over time. When the fracture occurred, it caught the crew unprepared, revealing that even sophisticated observation systems have limitations in environments that are inherently unstable and capable of sudden change. Advanced monitoring systems at McMurdo included fibre optic strain sensors embedded in the ice, thermal probes, and laser scanning devices designed to detect minute deformations over time. Engineers also employed 3D mapping to track tunnel geometry and identify potential weak points before they became critical. These instruments could log shifts as small as a millimetre, feeding data into predictive models intended to anticipate structural hazards. Despite this extensive instrumentation, the collapse revealed the limitations of technology in the face of complex ice dynamics, where rapid micro-movements and hidden stresses can accumulate undetected, silently undermining even the most meticulously reinforced passageways. Debris tumbled across the corridors, electrical conduits snapped, and the sudden darkness forced the crew to navigate disorienting hazards with only emergency lighting. The collapse severed power lines, disrupted communication, and created pockets of ice rubble that blocked access to critical areas. Personnel had to move cautiously, mindful of both physical injury and the threat of secondary collapses. Every decision carried weight. A misstep could worsen the damage or trap someone further within the compromised tunnel. The chaos highlighted the fragility of human infrastructure in an environment dominated by forces beyond human control. Safety protocols were activated immediately as trained personnel manoeuvred through unstable ice and confined spaces to evacuate colleagues and assess structural damage. Teams followed rehearsed drills, coordinating via handheld radios and emergency signals, while navigating narrow corridors crowded with debris. Medical officers and engineers worked side by side, ensuring injured personnel received prompt attention while evaluating structural integrity. The operation required precision, endurance, and calm under pressure, yet the unpredictability of the ice made each moment tense. Even with experience and preparation, the collapse demonstrated that the environment could challenge human skill and planning in unforeseen ways. Engineers analysed ice composition, load distribution, and thermal contraction, but the precise combination of factors leading to the failure remained unresolved. Stress fractures indicated that some sections of ice had shifted gradually over weeks, but the speed and location of the collapse suggested additional contributing variables. Researchers considered subsurface melting, uneven pressure from snow accumulation, and subtle movements of underlying bedrock, yet no single explanation accounted for the sudden fracture. The combination of known factors and unknown anomalies left the event partially unexplained, underscoring the limitations of human understanding when confronting a living, shifting environment like the Antarctic ice. Scientific and logistical operations were suspended, leaving equipment stranded and the station's confidence in its infrastructure shaken. Tunnels that had functioned reliably for years suddenly became obstacles, forcing teams to reroute supplies and adjust experiment schedules. Researchers moved cautiously in areas adjacent to the collapse, aware that the structural integrity of neighbouring passages could also be compromised. The event imposed a psychological toll. Personnel were forced to confront the stark reality that their work depended on delicate ice structures, fragile and unpredictable, upon which every plan and schedule relied. Investigation revealed stress patterns and subtle fractures that had gone unnoticed, but the unpredictability of ice dynamics ensured some questions would remain unanswered. Even the most detailed records of temperature, pressure, and material stress could not fully account for the interplay of forces that led to the collapse. Ice is simultaneously solid and dynamic, shifting imperceptibly and sometimes catastrophically. Engineers and researchers could hypothesize and model, but the mystery remained partly elusive, a reminder that the natural environment can elude even meticulous observation and planning, leaving human understanding incomplete. Shards of ice and faint hairline cracks linger as a silent record of the collapse, a reminder that stability in this frozen environment is fleeting. The fractured passages bear witness to the immense forces of nature, forces that exist outside human expectation and control. Equipment, structures, and personnel alike had been tested, and while reconstruction was possible, the underlying fragility of the ice tunnels remained a persistent concern. Each creaking shift, each unseen fracture is a subtle warning that the environment can alter the landscape suddenly, irreversibly, and without explicit precedent. The tunnels hold their secrets still, a quiet testament to forces that can erase human certainty in an instant. The Neumayer Station subsurface anomalies. Consistency is the unspoken foundation of subsurface science, where years of accumulated data are expected to behave in quiet, predictable ways. Instruments buried beneath Antarctic research stations are designed to record subtle changes in ice movement, temperature gradients, and pressure variations with remarkable reliability, forming long, uninterrupted timelines that scientists come to trust. At Neumayer Station, operated by Germany's Alfred Wegener Institute, those timelines stretched back decades, creating one of the most stable subsurface datasets on the continent. It was within this framework of routine monitoring that researchers first noticed something unusual, a cluster of readings that did not align with any known environmental pattern, quietly marking the beginning of what would later be referred to as the Neumayer subsurface anomalies. Under ordinary conditions, the instruments tasked with reading what lies below Antarctic stations produce patterns so stable that deviations are immediately conspicuous. Neumeyer's subsurface monitoring systems include seismic sensors, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and temperature probes installed at varying depths to track ice dynamics and underlying geological features. These tools are essential for understanding ice shelf stability and for ensuring the station's structural safety. When a series of measurements began to show irregular fluctuations, the initial assumption was mundane: sensor drift, calibration error, or electronic interference. Such issues are common enough in polar environments, where extreme cold can strain even hardened equipment. To rule out simple failure, technicians compared outputs across independent systems that rarely disagree unless something external interferes. Data from multiple sensors, operating on separate power supplies and logging intervals, began to show similar anomalies clustered within the same subsurface layers. This convergence raised concern, as it suggested the readings were not the result of a single malfunctioning device. Engineers performed recalibrations during maintenance windows, while analysts cross-checked archived data to confirm that the patterns were genuinely new. Each verification step narrowed the range of ordinary explanations without fully resolving the inconsistency. What drew particular attention was not the strength of the signals themselves, but their depth, persistence, and gradual lateral movement through the ice. The anomalies appeared tens of meters below the surface, deeper than the layers most affected by seasonal temperature changes. Over weeks, the irregularities seemed to drift horizontally, as if something within the ice was slowly migrating. Such movement did not match known models of ice flow at Neumeyer's location, which is situated on the Ekstrom ice shelf, an area considered comparatively stable. The behaviour was subtle, yet unmistakable to those familiar with the station's long-term records. Several environmental explanations were examined in sequence, each grounded in well-documented polar processes that normally account for irregular subsurface behaviour. Researchers considered the possibility of hidden meltwater channels forming beneath the station, even though surface temperatures at Neumayer rarely rise high enough to support significant melting. Tidal flexing of the ice shelf was also reviewed, as the Ekstrom ice shelf does respond to oceanic forces below. However, tidal signatures are rhythmic and predictable, unlike the slow, uneven shifts recorded during the anomaly period. Known geological features beneath the ice were mapped again, revealing nothing new that could easily account for the readings. Timing added another layer of uncertainty as the anomalies emerged without aligning to storms, seasonal shifts, or measurable surface disturbances. Antarctic storms can transmit vibrations through the ice, and heavy winds sometimes register as noise in sensitive instruments, but meteorological logs showed no corresponding events. The anomalies also persisted through calm periods, undermining the idea that they were transient responses to surface conditions. Their appearance during routine operations, rather than during an extreme event, made them harder to contextualize within existing frameworks of polar monitoring. Archived records from other long-running Antarctic stations were pulled for comparison, revealing how unusual the Neumayer readings were by polar standards. Data from stations such as Halley and Princess Elizabeth showed occasional irregularities, but these were typically brief and traceable to known causes. Neumeyer's anomaly stood out for its duration and coherence across multiple instruments. While not dramatic enough to trigger immediate safety concerns, it was persistent enough to merit internal discussion among glaciologists and geophysicists familiar with Antarctic subsurface behaviour. Rather than triggering evacuation or public concern, the response took the form of cautious procedural adjustments and extended monitoring periods. Instrument sensitivity thresholds were modified slightly, allowing researchers to observe the anomalies without overwhelming the system with alerts. Additional manual checks were scheduled, and data transmission protocols were reviewed to ensure no compression or processing artifacts were influencing the results. Notably, no public statements were issued at the time, reflecting a common practice in polar research to avoid speculation until clearer explanations emerge. As reports accumulated, interpretations began to diverge, with no single explanation managing to reconcile every recorded inconsistency. Some researchers suggested that slow-deforming ice structures, previously undetected, could be responsible, while others raised the possibility of subtle interactions between the ice shelf and underlying ocean currents. A more cautious view held that the anomalies represented a convergence of minor factors rather than a single cause. Without direct access to the depths in question, each hypothesis remained partially supported yet incomplete. Even after recalibrations reduced the most extreme deviations, the subsurface data never fully returned to its earlier baseline. The anomalies gradually faded, but traces of irregularity lingered in the datasets, leaving a visible seam in the station's otherwise orderly records. Over time, attention shifted to newer research priorities, and the episode receded into internal documentation rather than formal publication. Yet for those who worked with the data firsthand, the memory of that quiet disruption remained, an unresolved interval that resisted easy classification. What lingered beneath the station was not a confirmed phenomenon or a documented hazard, but a brief interval of measurements that resisted explanation and quietly settled into the unresolved margins of Antarctic research. The Lake Ellsworth drilling termination. Years of planning can narrow toward a single irreversible action, where hesitation becomes as consequential as failure. Polar science often unfolds this way, with preparation stretching across decades and execution compressed into brief windows where conditions, machinery and human judgment must align precisely. The Lake Ellsworth drilling project was conceived within that fragile margin, designed to reach a body of water sealed beneath more than 3 kilometers of Antarctic ice. When the operation was terminated before contact was made, the decision appeared procedural on the surface, yet it marked a rare moment when a major scientific effort stopped just short of its defining objective, leaving its significance suspended in uncertainty. Scientific interest in isolated Antarctic lakes stems from the possibility that entire ecosystems may have persisted without contact for immense spans of time. Lake Ellsworth, buried beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, was identified through radar surveys as a relatively small but well-defined subglacial lake, isolated from surface influences for hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers hoped its waters might preserve chemical signatures or microbial life adapted to darkness, pressure, and extreme cold. Such findings could inform understanding of Earth's climate history and even guide the search for life in similar environments beyond the planet. Unlike many polar field projects, this operation depended on a sequence of steps that could not be paused, reordered, or corrected once initiated. The plan relied on hot water drilling, using heated, filtered water to melt a narrow borehole through the ice. Every component had to meet strict cleanliness standards to avoid contaminating the lake, a requirement that added layers of complexity. The drilling system, water heaters, pumps, and sterilization units had to operate continuously and in harmony, because any prolonged interruption risked the borehole refreezing before the final depth was reached. Temperature, pressure, and timing formed a narrow corridor within which the drilling effort was permitted to continue. Antarctic ice closes in on voids quickly, and even minor delays can cause melted channels to constrict or seal entirely. Engineers calculated that the borehole would remain open for only a limited period, during which the drill head had to reach the lake and deploy instruments. Weather conditions also played a role, as extreme cold increased the strain on machinery and fuel systems. Within this tightly constrained environment, there was little tolerance for mechanical uncertainty. Logistical isolation amplified every complication, as Lake Ellsworth could only be accessed during a narrow seasonal window, supported by aircraft, fuel depots, and temporary field camps positioned hundreds of kilometres from permanent infrastructure. Any failure in power generation, water heating or transport could not be corrected quickly, and replacement components were not readily available once the drilling phase began. Unlike coastal stations with resupply options, this inland operation depended on advanced precision, meaning that even minor inefficiencies carried disproportionate consequences as time, fuel, and operational margin steadily diminished. Progress halted before the final depth was reached, not with an alarm or rupture, but through a controlled decision to stop. During the 2012 field season, the drilling team encountered technical difficulties that prevented the creation of a clean, stable borehole suitable for lake entry. Public statements cited problems with the hot water drilling system and concerns that contamination controls could not be guaranteed. With time running out and conditions deteriorating, project leaders concluded that proceeding further would compromise the scientific integrity of the lake, prompting the termination of the attempt. What followed was an absence rather than an event, marked by the lack of samples, images, or direct observations. No water was retrieved, no instruments were lowered into the lake, and no immediate second attempt was scheduled. In polar research, failed missions are not unusual, yet Lake Ellsworth's termination stood apart because of how close the drill had come to its target. The site was secured, equipment dismantled, and the field team withdrew, leaving the lake untouched and the original scientific questions unanswered. Subsequent technical summaries emphasized practical limitations while offering few details about the precise conditions at the point of termination. Reports described challenges related to borehole formation and system reliability, but stopped short of fully reconstructing the final hours of the operation. This restraint reflected standard scientific caution, avoiding speculation where data were incomplete. At the same time, the lack of detailed public analysis left observers with only a partial understanding of why the project could not be salvaged through redesign or extension. Elsewhere on the continent, comparable ambitions encountered setbacks without ending in permanent closure. Other subglacial lake projects faced delays, equipment failures, and environmental constraints, yet some eventually resumed after modification. In contrast, Lake Ellsworth did not return to the forefront of drilling plans in the years that followed. Funding priorities shifted, logistical challenges mounted, and attention turned to different sites. The lake remained mapped and documented, but inactive, a reminder that scientific opportunity can narrow as quickly as it opens. Over time, language surrounding the project shifted away from anticipation and toward archival finality. What had once been described in terms of discovery and first contact gradually became a case study in logistical complexity. References to Lake Ellsworth appeared increasingly in retrospective contexts, cited for its planning rigour rather than its results. This quiet transition underscored how scientific narratives evolve, not only through breakthroughs, but also through decisions to step back when conditions no longer permit advancement. Certain technical uncertainties remain unresolved simply because no further attempt was made to confront them. Questions about whether alternative drilling strategies could have succeeded, or whether minor adjustments might have preserved the borehole, linger without definitive answers. The ice above Lake Ellsworth continues to move slowly, preserving the lake's isolation while erasing the physical traces of the aborted effort. In the absence of renewed exploration, the moment when drilling stopped has become the defining feature of the project's legacy. The drill never reached the water, and whatever separated intention from restraint at Lake Ellsworth remains sealed beneath ice that has not been disturbed since. The Arctic Ice Station's SHEBA equipment failure. Scientific instruments had long depended on steady alignment, yet the Arctic drift introduced subtle shifts no one fully anticipated. The surface heat budget of the Arctic Ocean SHEBA project was conceived to collect continuous year-round data on atmosphere-ice-ocean interactions, a feat requiring precision instruments mounted across a drifting ice flow. Unlike fixed research stations, SHEBA's mobility was deliberate, allowing researchers to study an entire seasonal cycle while following the movement of sea ice. This mobility created unseen variables. Even minor misalignments of sensors or antennas could distort readings in ways that only became apparent weeks or months later. The station's design prioritized mobility across ice flows, creating vulnerabilities that became apparent only under extended observation. Platforms, cables and mounts had to accommodate both the weight of the station and the shifting, cracking ice beneath. The flow itself acted as both foundation and obstacle, compressing, tilting and stretching as temperatures fluctuated. Instruments intended for long-term deployment sometimes reacted unpredictably to even subtle changes, and engineers had to constantly anticipate the consequences of environmental stress on delicate electronic systems. Sensors intended to record continuous climate data began exhibiting irregular readings, leaving researchers unsure whether the ice or the equipment was at fault. Atmospheric radiometers, ocean thermistors and wind measurement devices occasionally reported values far outside expected ranges. Some discrepancies were traced to normal drift or natural variations, but others defied explanation. The ambiguity raised an unsettling question. Were the anomalies natural phenomena, subtle equipment failure, or a combination of both? Every new data point required verification, yet the harsh conditions limited the ability to perform repeated calibrations. Maintenance teams discovered that even minor power fluctuations could cascade, affecting multiple instruments simultaneously. Diesel generators, solar panels and battery banks powered the station under extreme cold, and energy distribution had to be carefully managed. When output dropped even slightly, sensitive instruments recorded inconsistencies, sometimes producing data that appeared scientifically significant, but was actually erroneous. Engineers quickly recognized that power management on a moving ice platform demanded constant vigilance, a task complicated by the logistical difficulty of safely working on shifting, uneven ice in sub-zero temperatures. As months passed, patterns emerged that suggested repeated anomalies were neither random nor isolated to a single system. Radiative flux measurements often spiked at the same time the ice cracked nearby, yet not all instruments were affected equally. Ocean temperature sensors occasionally froze or misread due to slight changes in water circulation beneath the ice. The accumulation of these subtle malfunctions created a complex web of uncertainty, forcing researchers to question how much of the dataset reflected environmental reality and how much was an artifact of station instability. Communication logs reveal careful documentation of every irregularity, yet the true cause remained elusive to the engineering teams. Field notes recorded manual calibrations, unusual readings, and attempted fixes, yet even these detailed entries could not fully explain the source of persistent anomalies. The interdisciplinary team of climatologists, engineers, and oceanographers reviewed logs repeatedly, trying to isolate the influence of ice movement, temperature swings, and mechanical fatigue. Despite the thorough record-keeping, many questions lingered, unresolved by the end of the observational year. Certain devices were recalibrated on site, but extreme cold and shifting ice limited the effectiveness of any repair. Technicians improvised with makeshift tools and heating methods, sometimes stabilizing individual instruments for days or weeks. Yet the relentless environmental conditions ensured that no repair was permanent. Connections loosened, mounts tilted, and wires contracted, introducing new inconsistencies even as old ones were addressed. Each fix was temporary, leaving researchers in a constant state of observation rather than resolution. The drifting platform itself introduced dynamic stress on equipment mounts, complicating attempts to stabilize instruments. Ice ridges and subtle tilts placed uneven loads on towers, solar panels, and sensor arrays. In some cases, equipment partially sank into the ice surface, altering calibration. The ice acted as a living foundation, slowly shifting under its own weight, and these micro-movements translated into measurable distortions in the data. Engineers could monitor these shifts, but could rarely intervene in a way that fully neutralized their effects. Researchers began analyzing the dataset with increased skepticism, noting gaps and inconsistencies that could not be corrected retroactively. Statistical comparisons revealed patterns that were clearly anomalous, but separating natural environmental variance from instrument-induced error proved nearly impossible. Published results emphasized verified subsets of data, leaving large portions of the record categorized as provisional. Yet even provisional data was scrutinized heavily, contributing to ongoing debates in polar climatology and studies of sea ice behavior. The SHEBA dataset thus became simultaneously invaluable and partially opaque. Despite continuous monitoring, the precise moment when individual sensors failed could not be determined with certainty. Some instruments ceased functioning gradually, recording plausible but subtly incorrect values before stopping entirely. Others failed suddenly during minor ice shifts or temperature spikes. The combined effect created a mosaic of reliability across the station. Some records remained accurate, some partially corrupted, and some irrecoverable. Understanding the boundaries between these zones of trust and uncertainty became a central unresolved challenge for SHEBA scientists. Even after the ice carried the station far from its original position, some data lingered in uncertainty, untouched and unexplained. The drifting ice flow eventually transported SHEBA out of the most active research zones, yet the ambiguity embedded in its record remained. Decades later, researchers continue to reference the dataset both for its valuable observations and for the cautionary lessons it provides about measurement in extreme mobile environments. Though no dramatic collapse occurred and no single catastrophic failure defines the mission, the lingering questions embedded in the SHEBA data have created a quiet, persistent mystery at the intersection of environment, engineering, and observation. Even as SHEBA's instruments rested silently on the shifting ice, portions of its record continued to drift in uncertainty, revealing a story the station itself could not fully tell. The Barrow Atmospheric Research Discrepancy. Long-term scientific confidence is built not through dramatic discoveries, but through years of measurements that rarely draw attention to themselves. Atmospheric science depends on continuity more than revelation, on the assumption that quiet repetition produces truth through accumulation rather than surprise. Instruments are designed to disappear into routine, becoming trusted precisely because they rarely provoke debate. At Arctic monitoring stations, this trust carries global consequences, as the data collected there informs climate baselines used far beyond polar latitudes. It was within this culture of assumed reliability that the Barrow Atmospheric Research Discrepancy emerged, not as a disruption, but as a faint tension beneath otherwise familiar records. Few research sites have been entrusted with defining atmospheric baselines as consistently as the monitoring facilities operating along Alaska's northern coast. Positioned to sample air masses entering the Arctic from lower latitudes, the Barrow Observatory has long been valued for its relative isolation and stable meteorological conditions. Measurements of carbon dioxide, methane, aerosols and trace gases collected there have been integrated into international datasets for decades. Because of this role, even minor irregularities carry disproportionate weight as they ripple outward into broader assessments of atmospheric change. Subtle irregularities began appearing not as alarms, but as numbers that refused to sit comfortably beside earlier expectations. Certain readings showed small but persistent departures from projected trends, remaining within accepted margins while defying simple explanation. These variations were not dramatic enough to trigger immediate corrective action, yet they appeared often enough to resist dismissal as random noise. Over time, their recurrence suggested that something systematic might be influencing the measurements, even if its signature remained indistinct. Initial reviews focused on ordinary explanations that typically resolve minor deviations before they mature into larger concerns. Calibration drift, sensor degradation, and the effects of prolonged exposure to extreme cold were examined in detail. Arctic instruments endure thermal stress, ice accumulation, and mechanical fatigue that can subtly alter performance over long periods. While maintenance logs documented routine adjustments and replacements, none of these interventions fully accounted for the lingering discrepancies that continued to surface in the data. Comparison with external datasets introduced an unexpected complication rather than the clarity researchers had anticipated. When Barrow's measurements were aligned with observations from other high-latitude stations, agreement varied depending on the parameter and season. Some datasets tracked closely across sites, while others diverged in ways that resisted clear atmospheric interpretation. These inconsistencies raised questions about whether regional processes unique to northern Alaska were influencing the readings, or whether methodological differences between stations were amplifying small biases. Instrument sighting and intake design added another layer of uncertainty that could not be evaluated retroactively. At Barrow, air sampling systems are positioned to minimize local interference, yet subtle shifts in snow accumulation, prevailing wind exposure, and seasonal sea ice patterns can alter how representative incoming air truly is. Even millimeter-scale changes around intake structures may influence turbulence or boundary layer mixing. Because these microenvironmental conditions evolve gradually, their cumulative effects are difficult to reconstruct after the fact, leaving open the possibility that the discrepancy emerged from changes too slow to register as discrete events. Local conditions surrounding the station introduced variables that were difficult to isolate without altering the integrity of the observations themselves. Wind direction, sea ice extent, and surface temperature inversions can all influence how air is sampled, particularly in coastal Arctic environments. Occasional human activity, though limited, also had to be considered as a potential contributor under specific circumstances. Attempts to filter or exclude affected data risked introducing their own distortions, leaving researchers cautious about intervention. Over time, internal documentation reflected a careful shift in how certain measurements were categorized, processed, and quietly qualified. Technical notes began emphasizing uncertainty ranges and contextual limitations rather than definitive interpretations. This change did not indicate a loss of confidence, but an adjustment in tone that acknowledged unresolved factors. The data remained valid and widely used, yet accompanied by an awareness that not all influences had been fully identified or constrained. The broader implications surfaced slowly as downstream analyses began accounting for uncertainty that could not be traced to a single source. Climate models relying on Arctic baselines adjusted confidence intervals and sensitivity analyses accordingly. These changes were subtle, often invisible outside specialist circles, but they signalled recognition that even foundational datasets require continual reassessment. The discrepancy did not invalidate conclusions, yet it complicated efforts to attribute precise causes or rates of change. Independent reanalysis efforts occasionally revisited the Barrow record using updated statistical techniques, seeking patterns that earlier frameworks might have overlooked. These methods examined long-term variance, seasonal asymmetries, and correlations with large-scale circulation shifts such as Arctic amplification and altered jet stream behaviour. While such analyses sometimes reduced the apparent discrepancy, they rarely eliminated it entirely. Instead, they suggested that the signal may be distributed across multiple interacting factors, none dominant enough to stand alone, yet collectively persistent across successive analytical approaches. No definitive threshold was ever crossed that would allow the discrepancy to be formally declared resolved or explained. There was no singular event, recalibration, or discovery that restored complete clarity. Instead, the issue persisted as an unresolved background condition, acknowledged but not conclusively addressed. Its endurance highlighted the limits of observational certainty in environments where variables cannot be fully controlled. What endured instead was a sustained ambiguity embedded within records that continued to be cited, modelled, and referenced. The Barrow data retained its central role in atmospheric science, but carried with it an unspoken caution. Each subsequent use implicitly accepted that some aspects of the measurements resisted full explanation. The discrepancy became part of the dataset's context, rather than a problem to be cleanly solved. The discrepancy at Barrow persists not as an anomaly that can be isolated, but as a reminder that even the most trusted measurements may carry uncertainties that never fully announce themselves. The Pyramiden Research Presence reports. Abandoned places often acquire a second life through paperwork long after human activity has supposedly ceased. In the Arctic, settlements that once thrived for mining or logistical purposes often leave behind infrastructure that is maintained selectively, documented partially, and observed irregularly. Pyramiden, a former Soviet coal town on Svalbard, is one such site. Its preserved buildings, streets, and port facilities present a paradox. Visually intact yet largely uninhabited, its role in Arctic research became a subject of speculation. The presence reports suggest intermittent occupation, yet no record clearly explains the purpose, the personnel, or the organisation behind it. Pyramiden occupies a rare position among Arctic settlements, preserved in structure but ambiguous in purpose. The Norwegian authorities responsible for Svalbard maintain the site primarily as a cultural and historical asset, while access is strictly regulated. Yet, official inventories do not mention permanent scientific stations there, raising questions whenever reports of research activity surface. This duality, maintained yet largely dormant, creates an environment where minor activity can leave disproportionate traces. In the absence of public acknowledgement, Small signals, lights, equipment movements, or utility usage become the primary indicators of something that might have occurred. Reports of activity surfaced gradually, embedded in references that treated presence as incidental rather than noteworthy. Internal Norwegian records, supply logs, and international shipping manifests occasionally allude to personnel movements that align with research timelines, yet never specify the nature of the work conducted. Notes may mention temporary monitoring or environmental visits, but the documents never confirm which institutions were responsible. Even when these references appear in conjunction with known seasonal activity, such as scientific campaigns in Svalbard, their ambiguity persists. The pattern is one of hints rather than confirmations, leaving observers to infer presence from indirect documentation. Material traces offered stronger hints than official statements ever did. Winterized buildings showed evidence of heating cycles inconsistent with tourism or preservation-only activity. Dockside warehouses recorded unusual power consumption, and storage areas contained containers and equipment that suggested technical rather than recreational use. These signals, while subtle, indicated organised occupancy. They implied an intentional program operating within the legal frameworks of Svalbard, but outside the scope of standard research reporting. The anomaly lies in the coordination necessary to maintain such presence while leaving minimal formal traces. Even mundane logistical patterns hinted at unusual operations. Routine snow clearance schedules deviated from expected timelines, and maintenance of diesel generators occurred outside the documented staff rotations. Communication lines registered periodic bursts of data transmission at hours inconsistent with typical work or tourist activity, yet no records indicate the content or purpose of these signals. Weather stations and monitoring instruments showed minor adjustments in calibration logs that were never officially explained, suggesting human intervention. These cumulative, subtle signals transformed the settlement into a patchwork of evidence, each piece pointing toward organised presence yet leaving the overarching intent frustratingly undefined. Descriptions of the activity shifted subtly depending on the document, never settling into a consistent classification. One report might categorise operations as environmental sampling, another as logistical maintenance, and yet another as temporary habitation. The lack of consensus illustrates both administrative caution and the difficulty of categorising ambiguous Arctic operations. For external analysts, this variability complicates any effort to assess whether the activity was routine, experimental, or part of broader undisclosed programs. Each document adds a layer to the mystery, revealing intentional movement yet offering no definitive conclusions. Formal research outputs failed to appear in proportion to the implied level of on-site work. No publications, datasets, or field notes emerged that could confirm the type or scope of activity suggested by presence reports. This absence is particularly striking in the context of Arctic research, where environmental monitoring is typically published to secure funding, justify permits, or inform policy. The lack of corresponding outputs reinforces the sense of incompleteness. Personnel may have been present, yet their work, if any, remains largely invisible beyond administrative traces. Occasional observations from outside visitors added texture without delivering confirmation. Tour operators, photographers, and occasional scientists passing through Pyramiden noted signs of activity, lights at night, footprints in snow, or unidentifiable equipment. But these sightings were inconsistent and anecdotal. No one could definitively identify occupants or their purpose. Over time, these second-hand reports became part of the investigative record, filling in some gaps while deepening uncertainty. They emphasized that even in a monitored and regulated environment, presence can leave ephemeral signs that resist precise interpretation. Legal and administrative frameworks surrounding Svalbard complicated any attempt to draw clear institutional boundaries. Multiple nations operate in the archipelago under treaty provisions, while environmental protections limit intrusive inspections. Researchers and administrators must navigate a maze of permissions, seasonal restrictions, and jurisdictional nuances. These constraints make it plausible that temporary scientific or technical activity could occur without clear public documentation. The frameworks themselves, designed for clarity and protection, inadvertently allow ambiguity to persist, embedding uncertainty into otherwise transparent systems. As years passed, the trail thinned without ever reaching a conclusion. Logs and references became fewer, and subsequent investigations failed to clarify the nature of the reports. Infrastructure maintenance continued sporadically, yet no one claimed the activity publicly, and no coordinating agency fully accounted for it. Over time, the anomaly shifted from being a discrete puzzle to a persistent ambiguity embedded in the settlement's operational record. The silence of formal channels allowed speculation to grow, but never transformed hints into answers. Most striking in retrospect is how the question itself faded from active inquiry without ever being answered. While Arctic research generally prioritizes documentation and transparency, the Pyramiden reports remained largely unresolved, despite occasional audits, inspections, and analyses by researchers and regulators. The anomaly is not dramatic but cumulative. It consists of administrative traces, indirect observations, and unanswered questions that together suggest a presence that was never fully defined, understood, or explained. In a settlement designed to record its own function with industrial clarity, the unresolved question of who was there, and for what purpose, lingers as quietly as the buildings themselves. The Tristan da Cunha monitoring station interruption. The station perched on Tristan da Cunha's volcanic slopes has long stood as a solitary sentinel amid the expanse of the South Atlantic. Its isolated location, more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, creates a sense of both logistical challenge and scientific opportunity. Researchers rely on the outpost to gather consistent meteorological and oceanographic data in a region largely untouched by human activity. Yet, in a moment that has puzzled investigators, the station experienced an interruption in its operations that left data gaps, unexplained system anomalies, and questions that remain unresolved. The circumstances were subtle but significant, challenging assumptions about reliability in one of the world's most remote environments. Its instruments measure currents, winds, and atmospheric pressure, translating isolation into data that inform global climate models. Automated buoys, radar systems, and weather sensors feed information into satellite links that transmit findings to research centres thousands of kilometres away. Continuous operation is critical, as even brief interruptions can produce blind spots in long-term datasets. For Tristan da Cunha, where weather and ocean patterns are unpredictable and extreme, maintaining uninterrupted records is essential for understanding everything from storm formation to sea temperature fluctuations. The interruption at the station therefore had implications far beyond the immediate locale, raising concerns among climatologists and oceanographers who depend on its data. Initial hints of disruption appeared as small gaps in telemetry, subtle enough that they might have been dismissed as routine noise. Automated monitoring systems flagged irregular intervals between data transmissions, and some readings failed to register entirely. At first, analysts considered mundane explanations: temporary satellite outages, power fluctuations, or brief equipment restarts. Yet as patterns persisted over multiple days, it became clear that this was more than routine maintenance or transient error. The anomalies were intermittent but consistent, appearing across multiple sensor arrays and signalling a coordinated failure whose origin remained unclear. Access to the island is constrained by unpredictable shipping schedules, rough seas, and limited air connections, turning minor delays into operational challenges. Personnel rotations require careful planning, as the nearest port capable of hosting research vessels lies hundreds of kilometers away. Supplies, spare parts, and fuel must be delivered in advance, with contingencies for storms or mechanical failure. These logistical factors magnify the impact of any technical malfunction, because even minor repairs can take weeks to implement. In the case of the monitoring interruption, such delays complicated efforts to diagnose and resolve the anomalies promptly, leaving temporary reliance on automated systems with incomplete oversight. Logs and maintenance reports were consulted, but no single anomaly could account for the interruption or explain why multiple systems faltered simultaneously. Engineers and station managers reviewed power consumption, generator performance, and sensor calibration logs. All appeared within acceptable ranges individually, yet collectively, the data revealed inconsistencies in timing and sequencing. Communication systems had partially failed, but intermittent messages suggested that no total outage occurred. The result was an operational puzzle. The station seemed both functional and compromised at once, producing gaps in critical datasets while continuing to generate some readings: volcanic tremors, sudden storms, and swells from distant cyclones were considered, each environmental factor a plausible contributor yet ultimately inconclusive, Tristan da Cunha sits atop a volcanic island, and minor seismic activity is common, though typically insufficient to disrupt established monitoring equipment. Likewise, the South Atlantic experiences sporadic storms and swells that can impact power lines, satellite uplinks, and buoy deployments. Yet none of the recorded natural events aligned precisely with the timing of the interruptions. Investigators were left with the unsettling possibility that the disruption did not have a straightforward environmental explanation. Station personnel followed strict protocols, yet even disciplined routines leave room for human error, minor oversights, or gaps in documentation. Maintenance schedules, equipment checks, and data verification procedures are all rigorously documented, but remote conditions constrain attention and resources. The interruption coincided with a period when a small number of staff were present, and rotations meant that continuity relied heavily on adherence to routine. While no errors were officially reported, investigators could not fully exclude the possibility that subtle operational deviations contributed to the anomalies, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already complex situation. Remote troubleshooting offered partial solutions, though the distance and intermittent connectivity limited intervention to cautious incremental adjustments. Technicians attempted to reset communications, recalibrate instruments remotely, and cross-check sensor outputs with nearby buoys and satellite feeds. These measures provided temporary improvements but failed to restore full operational stability. Without the ability to deploy additional personnel immediately, engineers had to rely on predictive modelling and delayed data to infer causes, leaving the station in a semi-functional state for days. Each adjustment carried the dual risk of correcting errors or inadvertently introducing new discrepancies. The absence of continuous data left researchers grappling with uncertainty, affecting downstream models and long-term studies that rely on uninterrupted measurements. Ocean currents, wind patterns, and weather predictions were all partially obscured by gaps, forcing climatologists and marine scientists to interpolate missing values or adjust analyses. The interruption demonstrated how fragile even well-established observational systems can be when subjected to isolation, environmental stress, and technical complexity. In a region where data points are sparse, each missing measurement carries disproportionate weight, heightening the significance of what might otherwise seem a minor technical failure. No definitive explanation emerged, and the interruption quietly persisted in records that acknowledged the event without resolving it. Subsequent audits and reviews have noted the anomaly, yet none have been able to assign a clear cause or confirm whether it stemmed from human, mechanical, or environmental factors. Researchers continue to rely on incomplete datasets from the period, treating them with caution while acknowledging the limits of certainty. The station remains operational, yet the brief interruption has left an enduring footprint in records, a reminder that even remote, meticulously maintained research outposts are vulnerable to uncertainty. The monitoring station endures as a silent witness, its partial silence a reminder that even the most isolated outposts can harbour enigmas the world cannot fully trace. The Mauna Loa instrument sabotage question. The summit of Mauna Loa rises above Hawaii's clouds, hosting one of the most important atmospheric observatories on Earth. Yet a series of unexplained anomalies suddenly drew global attention. Perched at an altitude exceeding 3,400 meters, the site had long served as a sentinel for the planet's air, recording carbon dioxide levels and other greenhouse gases with meticulous precision. The observatory's remote location and uninterrupted data streams allowed scientists to detect even subtle shifts in atmospheric composition. Yet, during one critical period, measurements diverged in ways that could not be easily reconciled, raising questions about the reliability of readings that inform international climate assessments. For decades, this observatory has provided a global benchmark for carbon dioxide levels, weather patterns, and climate trends, its data forming the backbone of international environmental monitoring. The Mauna Loa dataset, often referenced in scientific journals and policy discussions alike, traces changes in CO2 concentration over half a century, revealing the incremental rise that has become emblematic of modern climate change. Its instruments are maintained according to the highest scientific standards, and each component undergoes careful calibration and scrutiny. The stakes of accurate measurement are not abstract. They shape understanding of global carbon cycles, inform emission reduction strategies, and guide predictive climate models. During a critical period of observation, several sensors produced inconsistent or missing readings, defying standard operational expectations and leaving staff uncertain of whether the cause was technical, environmental, or deliberate. The deviations were subtle enough to avoid immediate alarm, yet significant enough to prompt internal investigation. Carbon dioxide levels appeared to fluctuate outside expected seasonal trends, while other instruments reported intermittent gaps in data transmission. The anomalies coincided with routine maintenance checks, yet neither recalibration nor software diagnostics could fully account for the irregularities. For the first time in decades, the continuity of Mauna Loa's records was under question. Initial inspections of calibration records, power systems, and instrument logs revealed no apparent errors, creating a scenario where anomalies persisted despite rigorous procedural review. Every routine task, from sensor alignment to software updates, was documented in meticulous logs, yet none contained indications of mechanical failure or operator error. Engineers revisited the observatory's electrical systems, ruling out surges or interruptions that could explain the readings. This systematic review highlighted the tension between observable anomalies and traceable causes, a rare moment when empirical methods encountered a gap that could not be reconciled with known procedures. Natural factors such as volcanic emissions, tropical storms, or atmospheric electrical activity were considered, yet none fully accounted for the unusual patterns captured across multiple instruments. Mauna Loa itself is an active volcano, occasionally emitting small amounts of gas that influence local air composition. Meteorological conditions could introduce turbulence or localized pressure fluctuations, and seasonal shifts can affect atmospheric density. However, careful cross-referencing with external monitoring stations and satellite observations showed no external phenomena capable of producing the discrepancies. The result was a paradox. The environment was active and variable, yet the anomalies defied explanation grounded in natural processes. Access to the site is tightly controlled, and staff adhere to strict security protocols, which raise speculation about whether human interference, intentional or accidental, could have contributed to the irregularities. Key areas are monitored, entry is logged, and technicians follow standardized procedures to limit contamination or disturbance. Despite these measures, the possibility that someone could have tampered with sensitive equipment could not be entirely dismissed. While no evidence of intrusion was ever documented, the lack of a definitive environmental or mechanical explanation left room for questions about potential sabotage, even if only theoretical. The broader consequences of compromised readings extend beyond Mauna Loa itself, potentially impacting climate models, global CO2 tracking, and satellite calibration used by agencies worldwide. Data from the observatory feeds into networks that inform international treaties, policy decisions, and scientific publications. A sustained anomaly, if unrecognized, could propagate through modeling algorithms, influencing projections of future climate scenarios. This amplified the stakes of understanding the origin of the disruptions. A single gap in one of Earth's most trusted datasets could ripple across the scientific community, challenging assumptions that had long been treated as reliable. Remote diagnostic tools allowed partial assessment, but limitations inherent in physical isolation prevented complete verification, leaving gaps that neither technicians nor scientists could easily resolve. Engineers relied on telemetry, automated error logs, and remote software controls to test instruments without direct access. While these systems confirmed that hardware appeared intact and power supplies were stable, subtle sensor drift or software corruption remained plausible explanations. The inability to conduct continuous on-site observation compounded uncertainty, leaving investigators to piece together a puzzle without all of its components, relying on inference and comparison rather than direct measurement. Official statements, peer-reviewed reports, and internal communications acknowledged the anomalies but offered few definitive conclusions, highlighting how uncertainty can persist even in high-profile research. Public reports framed the event cautiously, emphasizing procedural review and ongoing monitoring rather than speculation. Internal memos discussed the possibility of minor sensor malfunction, yet refrained from assigning blame or suggesting sabotage without incontrovertible proof. This restraint reflected the scientific imperative to avoid unsupported claims, but for observers outside the observatory, it left a lingering sense of ambiguity and unanswered questions about a site that had otherwise symbolized precision and reliability. Ultimately, the question of whether the instrument failures were accidental, environmental, or deliberately induced remains unresolved, creating a tension between empirical science and lingering doubt. The anomaly occupies a rare space in scientific history, a high-profile disruption at a widely monitored site that, despite exhaustive review, resists definitive categorization. Scientists continue to rely on redundancy, cross-checks, and corroborating datasets to maintain confidence in broader climate observations. Yet the Mauna Loa episode endures as a cautionary tale about the limits of certainty, even under conditions designed for near-perfect control. The episode at Mauna Loa endures as a subtle yet persistent reminder that even the most meticulously monitored observatories can conceal mysteries that defy immediate explanation. The Arecibo Observatory Control Anomaly. Routine signals hummed across the enormous dish, yet subtle misalignments in the control readouts hinted at behaviour no operator could immediately explain. The Arecibo Observatory, with its 305-metre suspended reflector, had long been synonymous with precision, capable of tracking objects across the solar system and probing the radio waves of distant galaxies. On an otherwise routine observing schedule, engineers noted discrepancies in automated positioning that did not correspond to any recorded environmental conditions or planned adjustments. Though small, the deviations were persistent, appearing sporadically and resisting standard calibration. Observers could not attribute them to simple software bugs or mechanical drift, and the uncertainty grew with each pass of the radar system. Perched in the lush hills of Puerto Rico, the Arecibo Observatory had long been a cornerstone of planetary radar and radio astronomy, its immense dish silently recording the cosmos with unmatched scope. Built in the 1960s, the telescope had enabled discoveries ranging from the first mapping of asteroids to detailed observations of pulsars. Its operations depended on a delicate balance of electronics, hydraulics, and human oversight, with automated systems guiding the suspended platform above the dish to millimetre precision. Researchers and visiting scientists alike trusted in the instrument's reliability, yet the emerging anomalies suggested that even a well-established system could behave unpredictably, defying expectations of normal operation. The first discrepancies appeared as brief interruptions in automated tracking, anomalies so slight they could have been dismissed as transient glitches if not for their persistence. Antenna positioning would lag by fractions of a degree or shift in subtle, unpatterned ways. Signal reception occasionally registered faint noise spikes that were inconsistent with known sources of interference, from atmospheric effects to local radio transmissions. These events occurred across multiple nights and observation cycles, challenging the assumption that routine environmental factors were responsible. While each individual irregularity might have been inconsequential, their repeated presence indicated a phenomenon that neither human error nor immediate technical malfunction could fully explain. Engineers initiated exhaustive diagnostics, tracing servo responses, software logs, and power fluctuations, but each test returned only partial insight, leaving questions about the underlying cause unresolved. Mechanical inspections found no obvious wear or misalignment in the platform's suspension cables or the actuator systems. Software algorithms controlling the radar appeared free from corruption, and redundancy checks confirmed that multiple systems independently logged the same anomalies. Attempts to simulate the behaviour in controlled tests failed to replicate the subtle, irregular patterns observed in the field, reinforcing the sense that the issue existed in the interaction between machine, environment, and operational context. Tropical storms and rapid shifts in atmospheric pressure were considered, yet meteorological records revealed no events strong enough to account for the irregular movements recorded during the anomaly. High humidity and intermittent rainfall, typical for the Arecibo site, could affect electronics, but calibration tests showed that the system should have compensated for such variations. Lightning strikes were rare and accounted for in the observatory's surge protection protocols. Even during minor tremors, which occasionally occur in the region, the dish maintained precise positioning. The persistence of unexplained deviations despite these benign conditions suggested that the anomaly was not purely environmental, deepening the puzzle for the staff. Operators began to suspect that even routine maintenance procedures might interact unpredictably with automated systems, revealing how human oversight can subtly influence machine behavior. Every adjustment to software settings, every manual calibration of sensors introduced opportunities for minute inconsistencies to propagate. Yet no pattern in operator actions corresponded to the timing of anomalies. The staff meticulously cross-checked logs and schedules, looking for correlations in work shifts, software updates, or tool usage. Each inquiry highlighted the interplay between human intervention and automated systems, showing how complex observatories depend on precise coordination and how even a minor mismatch can ripple across critical operations. Scheduled observations were delayed, and research programs reliant on continuous data streams faced interruption, highlighting the operational consequences of a problem that was both elusive and persistent. Collaborative projects involving planetary radar imaging, asteroid tracking, and atmospheric studies all required consistent, precise pointing. Uncertainty in the system forced teams to pause or repeat measurements, slowing data collection. Visiting researchers and graduate students documented each anomaly in real time, creating supplementary logs in an effort to capture what the primary control systems could not. The impact was measured not in catastrophic failure, but in lost opportunities and mounting concern about the integrity of long-term data sets. Internal reports documented every anomaly with meticulous care, logging timestamps, instrument readings, and operator actions, but gaps in the data persisted where replication proved impossible. Engineers noted the dish's exact angular deviations, the behavior of the actuator motors, and even the environmental conditions for each occurrence. Yet despite exhaustive records, the anomalies resisted categorization. Patterns hinted at intermittent electrical noise or software timing discrepancies, but no conclusive proof emerged. These meticulous logs ensured that future analysis would have a detailed account of the anomalies, even if the root cause remained undetermined, leaving a lingering question mark over one of the world's most precise instruments. Comparisons with radar systems at other observatories demonstrated that while minor anomalies were common elsewhere, none matched the inexplicable combination of repetition and subtlety observed at Arecibo. Systems in similar tropical and temperate observatories occasionally registered erratic servo behavior or signal interference, but the precision of Arecibo made these events unusual in scale and frequency. The anomaly was neither catastrophic nor immediately observable to casual monitoring, yet its persistence challenged assumptions about reliability. International partners noted the deviations in collaborative datasets, adding pressure to resolve the issue while maintaining confidence in results that had far-reaching scientific implications. Months passed without a definitive explanation, and the anomaly became part of the station's operational history, a puzzle that challenged engineers, scientists, and software alike. Despite ongoing observation, redundancy checks, and software revisions, the deviations continued to occur intermittently, resisting attempts at isolation or correction. The observatory maintained its schedule for routine observations, yet each anomaly served as a reminder of the limits of human understanding when interacting with highly complex systems. It became clear that even the most robust engineering safeguards could not fully anticipate every subtle, emergent behavior that a technologically intricate environment might produce. The Arecibo anomaly remains a quiet reminder that even instruments designed for perfect precision can harbor secrets that elude both observation and explanation. The Atacama Desert ALMA signal contamination. Unexpected distortions began appearing in streams of data, subtle enough to evade immediate notice yet persistent enough to raise concern among the ALMA team. The observatory's antennas, distributed across the high plateau, were designed to work in concert, producing interferometric images of the sky with unmatched resolution. Early anomalies were so faint that they were initially dismissed as statistical noise or minor calibration inconsistencies, yet their repetition across multiple nights suggested a phenomenon that could not be ignored. For researchers accustomed to interpreting faint cosmic signals, even minor deviations can signify profound unknowns, and the pattern at ALMA immediately demanded scrutiny. Precision instruments designed to capture millimeter waves from distant galaxies suddenly reported inconsistencies that challenged the observatory's reputation for accuracy. The engineering protocols at ALMA require every receiver, amplifier, and signal processor to be meticulously aligned. Any discrepancy could compromise the integrity of multi-antenna synthesis. Observing sessions began to reveal faint spikes at frequencies that should have remained clean, provoking questions about whether the issue originated from hardware, software, or some unaccounted-for interference. Each anomalous signal, while small in amplitude, carried the weight of potential misinterpretation, threatening to obscure delicate readings from star-forming regions light years away. A faint but recurring pattern emerged in the spectral readings, an irregularity that refused to fit with the anticipated cosmic signatures. It appeared as a subtle contamination across several antennas, but never in isolation, suggesting that the interference was systemic rather than localized. The team examined correlation matrices, timing logs, and environmental sensors, seeking any discrepancy that could explain the anomaly. Despite rigorous checks, no single source of error could be identified, and the persistence of the pattern across multiple nights implied either a hidden mechanical flaw or a subtle environmental effect interacting with the system in unexpected ways. Engineers initially turned to internal systems and calibration logs, searching for faults in electronics, software, or procedural missteps. Receivers were tested for gain drift, signal cables examined for electromagnetic leakage, and data pipelines scrutinized for software artifacts. Every element functioned within nominal specifications, yet the contamination persisted. In some instances, it manifested as low-amplitude spectral ghosts, reflections of signals not produced by the universe but by unknown processes affecting the instruments. Each unsuccessful investigation heightened the sense of unease among the team, because precision instruments are designed to eliminate nearly all uncertainty, yet the interference defied every standard check. Environmental factors were considered next, but atmospheric explanations alone failed to account for the anomalies appearing across multiple observation sessions. The thin air, low humidity, and minimal cloud cover of the plateau make the site ideal for millimeter astronomy, yet subtle turbulence, temperature fluctuations, or charged particle activity could not fully account for the recurring signals. Even rare windborne interference, dust deposition on antennas, and thermal gradients inside receivers were studied, revealing only minor contributions. None of these conditions could reproduce the spectral contamination, leaving researchers with a growing awareness that the anomaly might be produced by an unseen factor beyond conventional instrumentation or meteorology. The interference compromised critical studies, subtly altering datasets for star-forming regions and distant galaxies, leaving researchers with ambiguous results. Subtle shifts in baseline readings changed the apparent brightness and position of faint sources, introducing small errors that multiplied across interferometric images. The ALMA team was forced to introduce data corrections, yet these only masked the symptom without identifying the root cause. Scientists reliant on these observations for modelling molecular clouds and tracing early galactic evolution faced a dilemma: trust the data at risk of contamination or delay research, while the anomaly remained unresolved. Careful documentation and repeated experimentation revealed that certain frequencies were more susceptible than others, hinting at a systemic irregularity rather than a random error. Observers noted that the interference was slightly stronger at longer baselines, suggesting that antenna alignment and cross-correlation procedures might interact subtly with the unidentified contamination. Tests using known calibration sources confirmed that the anomaly could not be reproduced under controlled conditions elsewhere, reinforcing the idea that its origin was tied to a unique combination of sight, instrumentation, and operational factors. The observations transformed from routine measurements into a meticulous investigation of uncertainty itself. Despite meticulous cross-checks, the anomaly persisted, prompting the development of new processing protocols to compensate for the unexplained contamination. Software filters were applied to subtract the recurring signatures, and observation schedules were adjusted to minimize periods when the anomaly was most pronounced. While these strategies reduced the visibility of interference, they did not reveal its source, leaving a sense of provisional control without resolution. Each correction required careful documentation, ensuring that future datasets could be interpreted with awareness of both the contamination and the compensatory adjustments. Collaborators worldwide noted the irregular readings, but even external comparisons could not resolve the persistent uncertainties embedded within the observatory's measurements. Data sent to international archives, cross-referenced with observations from other facilities, confirmed that the anomaly was unique to ALMA. No other millimeter arrays, despite operating under similar conditions, had encountered comparable interference, underscoring the possibility that the contamination emerged from the combination of extremely high precision, site-specific conditions, and instrument design. The anomaly became a subject of quiet discussion at conferences and in technical papers, often cited as a cautionary example of unexplained system behavior in high-stakes observational science. The true origin of the interference remained an open question, lingering across observation cycles as a puzzle the team had yet to solve. ALMA continued to operate, producing groundbreaking data on the universe while simultaneously accommodating the anomaly through procedural workarounds. Each observing session carried the shadow of the contamination, reminding scientists that even their most controlled experiments could encounter subtle forces beyond immediate understanding. The persistence of these unexplained signals fostered a mix of caution, curiosity, and respect for the limits of technological certainty. Even in a system designed for unparalleled precision, the ALMA contamination lingers as a quiet reminder that the universe, and the tools used to observe it, may conceal secrets beyond immediate comprehension. The Gough Island Researcher Death Review. A lone South Atlantic speck of volcanic rock nearly 2,600 kilometers from the nearest continental landmass, Gough Island is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. Defined by towering cliffs and relentless seas and alive with millions of seabirds, yet in 2014 it became the site of a haunting and unanswered tragedy that still ranks among the station mysteries that defy simple explanation. On this remote British overseas territory, where teams of meteorologists, technicians, biologists and support staff rotate yearly to man South Africa's weather and research station, life is precarious. Survival is tethered to routine and every mission carries the weight of isolation and risk. The team at the station is small but hardy, typically composed of a senior meteorologist, junior colleagues, a radio technician, a medic, and a mechanical specialist, all prepared to endure months without relief in one of the world's loneliest outposts. This continuous human presence, maintained since the mid-20th century, transforms the island's harsh climatology into a backdrop for both scientific observation and occasionally human drama. On the night of February 11, 2014, that continuity was ruptured by the sudden death of a crew member, an event that has since cast long shadows over both official reporting and the quiet recollections of those who served beside him. Johannes Adrian Hoffmann, a skilled electronic technician with years of experience maintaining critical communication systems for the South African National Antarctic Programme, was found dead in his bed in the early hours of that February morning. The information released at the time was sparse, couched in the procedural language of investigation, and framed against the routine duties that never wavered even in the face of tragedy. Hoffmann had returned to Gough for his second expedition. Colleagues remembered him as competent and steady, a man used to working within the unforgiving rhythms of isolated fieldwork where the weather could change without warning and outside help might be weeks away. Initial reports from the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa spoke of uncertainty, a cause of death under review, and plans for the body's recovery by South Africa's research vessel, SA Agulhas. The island, accessible only by sea or supply helicopter, presented logistical challenges that underscored the fragility of human life there. Extreme distance magnified every decision, every moment of waiting. The SA Agulhas would take approximately a week to reach the station with Hoffmann's body and accompanied personnel, a voyage that itself became part of the slow and solemn narrative that unfolded. Medical updates offered as official clarifications were limited, but doctors involved in the preliminary review suggested that Hoffmann had choked after bringing food back up, a scenario described as choking on vomit. This conclusion was tentative and couched in the careful phrasing customary to post-mortem reviews pending further evidence. Counselling was arranged for the remaining team members, acknowledging not just the shock of loss far from home, but the psychological weight borne by those who remained to carry on with their duties under surveillance from relentless winds and towering cliffs. The tragedy was noted beyond scientific circles, recorded in the modest annals of an island that already carried a reputation for extremes. Severed weather stations, shipwrecks on jagged reefs, and researchers observing nature at its most raw. Some who have studied Gough's remote ecology speak of the island with a mixture of reverence and foreboding, aware that invasive species like supersized mice are driving seabirds toward extinction, even as human oddities and accidents punctuate the station's timeline. Over the years, there have been other deaths associated with life on the island, including exposures and accidents involving people navigating its steep, unforgiving terrain. 3 colleagues lost to exposure and 1 swept out to sea by rogue waves have become part of the whispered lore around the station, reminders that this isolated frontier is indifferent to human presence. The spectre of those losses adds a layer of tension to the documented account of Hoffman's death, inviting questions about the interplay between environment, circumstance, and the human body pushed to its limits. Despite the official account, some researchers and observers familiar with the broader context of fieldwork on Gough speak quietly about unanswered questions, whether sudden physiological collapse in isolation might mask underlying causes never fully adjudicated, how long delays in communication and retrieval shape narratives, and the extent to which remoteness complicates even the most routine of investigations. No independent coroner's report has been published in accessible archives, and the fragmentary nature of shared records leaves gaps that public accounts have not filled. Meanwhile, the station continues its work amid a landscape defined by swirling winds, dense mists, and cliffs that plummet into the roiling Southern Ocean, underscoring both the sheer necessity of scientific observation and the ever-present risk that life beyond settled lands entails. The remote teams carry on, watching skies and sea temperatures and weather patterns critical to understanding global systems, even as every return voyage draws eyes back to earlier tragedies that seem at once explained and inexplicably persistent in their unease. For those who study the island's ecological dramas, from invasive mice to endangered albatross, Hoffman's death was not merely a statistical footnote but part of a broader tapestry of hardship and mystery that defines Gough Island's human and natural histories alike. The questions that linger around the circumstances of his final hours have never wholly dissipated, and each passing season on the island draws a new set of observers into the persistent silence left by that long night in February 2014, when an experienced technician quietly breathed his last, far from the shores of any continent. A single unanswered question hovered over Gough Island long after the winds had carried the S.A. Agulhas home, a question that demanded to be heard in the emptiest reaches of the South Atlantic. The Novaya Zemlya sealed observation logs. Behind the frozen cliffs of Novaya Zemlya, the Soviet-era research station loomed like a silent sentinel over the Arctic expanse, its metal corridors holding the weight of observations never fully revealed. Winds howled over jagged ice fields, rattling equipment and making every step outside a challenge, yet inside the station, meticulous routines masked the relentless extremity of the environment. Within the sterile lights and steel panels, every measurement, note and reading was recorded with rigid discipline, yet the sealed observation logs, kept from public view for decades, hinted at phenomena that even those who worked there could scarcely interpret or question aloud. Within the station, every instrument and logbook followed strict protocols, with teams recording temperature, wind patterns, and auroral activity under conditions that tested both endurance and precision. Arctic days and nights blurred into each other during the polar winter, and equipment was monitored around the clock to capture minute variations in solar activity, ice movement, and atmospheric pressure. Researchers endured sub-zero temperatures and long periods of isolation, their observations forming the backbone of Soviet Arctic science, yet certain anomalies were never shared outside the station. The meticulous adherence to procedure only amplified the tension surrounding the undisclosed logs. Some of the observation logs, however, were not merely stored, they were deliberately sealed, stamped with official classifications that have never been publicly explained or released. The covers bore bold red lettering and complex ciphers, signalling a level of secrecy rarely encountered even in Cold War-era documentation. Access was restricted to select personnel, and those who filed the logs were often aware that the most unusual entries would be hidden, leaving corridors and shelves lined with data that might never be examined beyond the station's own walls. Even routine maintenance of these files required bureaucratic approval, further underscoring the strict hierarchy and control over information. Historical meteorological reports from the region hinted anomalies during the years when the station's sealed logs were generated, suggesting disruptions that remain absent from the official archives. Sudden temperature spikes, unexplained sensor readings, and unusual auroral activity appear in fragmentary Soviet compilations. but no comprehensive explanation was ever provided. The discrepancies, subtle yet consistent, have persisted in post-declassification analyses, prompting historians and climatologists to wonder whether they were the result of natural phenomena or observations the original station commanders chose to record in secrecy. The harsh environment magnified the significance of every anomaly, making each unexplained observation feel more urgent. Researchers and technicians tasked with filing and maintaining these records operated under layers of secrecy, often aware that certain entries were to be excluded from routine summaries. Officers trained in Arctic operations understood that concealment was part of the protocol, whether for political, military, or experimental reasons. Those responsible for documentation developed a tacit understanding of which events could be noted and which were to be filed away, leaving gaps that would puzzle anyone attempting to reconstruct a continuous timeline of activity on the archipelago. Even minor discrepancies in log entries could trigger formal reviews, adding to the tension of daily work. Occasional declassified excerpts provide glimpses of activity at the station, but gaps appear like deliberate omissions, leaving an impression of purposefully obscured phenomena. Some entries describe routine weather readings, sea ice observations, and equipment maintenance, but between these lines are missing pages and blurred references that suggest either removal or non-recording. Scholars and analysts who have reviewed these fragments note an unease in the records, a sense that certain observations were deemed too sensitive for inclusion in broader reports, even decades later. The missing or redacted logs have fueled speculation among scientists who study Arctic climatology, raising questions about whether environmental or geophysical events were quietly documented and then hidden from public view. Researchers debate whether seismic anomalies, unusual aurora patterns, or sudden magnetic fluctuations might have been captured but withheld. The exact nature of what was observed and why it was considered unfit for release remains speculative, yet the very existence of these sealed records suggests that the station's data may have held insights far beyond what was ever publicly acknowledged. Some scientists have even compared the missing data to other Arctic anomalies, noting patterns that make the omissions all the more compelling. International interest in Novaya Zemlya's research has grown over decades, but the Cold War-era restrictions and geographic isolation ensured that outsiders could only witness fragments of its operational record. Foreign scientists often relied on partial datasets or post-Soviet summaries, encountering the same gaps that confounded Soviet archivists. Supply missions and observation reports, even when documented, were filtered through layers of bureaucratic control, creating a landscape where knowledge existed yet remained fundamentally inaccessible to all but a select few within the station. The long Arctic nights amplified both the isolation and the weight of these silences. Attempts to locate, request, or examine the sealed logs in the post-Soviet era have produced partial answers at best, and each fragmentary record deepens the sense of an unresolved narrative. Scholars accessing declassified archives find pages annotated, censored, or missing entirely, suggesting deliberate exclusion of certain entries. The patterns of omission themselves raise questions. Why some anomalies were noted while others disappeared, and what internal discussions or decisions guided these actions remains unknown, leaving the shadow of the station's work incomplete. The interplay between transparency and secrecy becomes almost palpable in each archival corridor. The combination of meticulous observation and deliberate concealment has left a historical record that is simultaneously precise and profoundly enigmatic, a testament to the unknown elements quietly recorded within the Arctic station. Every measurement was exact, every procedure enforced, yet the absence of explanation transforms certainty into unease. In an environment where human presence is scarce, where every log can be a lifeline to knowledge, the sealed observation logs of Novaya Zemlya represent a silent archive of truths that may never fully surface, each page a whisper of what remains deliberately unspoken. Somewhere within the frozen archives of Novaya Zemlya, the sealed logs lie untouched, their contents whispering enigmas that may never meet the light of day. The Wrangel Island monitoring interruption. Signals that had been streaming uninterrupted for years abruptly ceased, leaving Arctic monitoring teams staring at blank screens in disbelief. Instruments designed to track permafrost shifts, ocean currents, and local seismic activity all stopped reporting simultaneously, an event unprecedented in the station's decades-long operation. Technicians were confronted with an immediate void where continuous streams of data had once provided certainty. The Arctic environment, known for its harsh winds and icy terrain, allowed little room for error, yet the failure occurred without any apparent environmental trigger, leaving the team both puzzled and uneasy about what had caused such a coordinated disruption. The station's instruments had been recording everything from soil temperatures to atmospheric pressure and ocean salinity, each reading feeding into extensive climatological models relied upon by scientists around the world. Wrangel Island, sitting at the edge of the Arctic basin, was a critical point for monitoring changes in sea ice and permafrost, as fluctuations here could signal broader global trends. Every device had been calibrated to operate autonomously, and engineers had meticulously checked the systems before deployment. Yet, when the readings abruptly stopped, even the most experienced personnel found themselves questioning the reliability of equipment they had long assumed to be infallible. Redundancy was the core principle of the network, designed so that even individual equipment failures would never compromise the continuity of observation. Multiple instruments measured the same variables independently, and backup systems were intended to take over automatically if one component failed. Sensors communicated across isolated nodes, creating a safety net meant to prevent exactly the kind of total blackout the team faced. The simultaneous failure of every redundant system defied conventional logic, raising the possibility that either an unknown environmental factor or an undetected systemic anomaly had interfered with operations on an unprecedented scale. On a single morning, every independent sensor stopped transmitting simultaneously, a coordination of inactivity that contradicted both the station's technical safeguards and years of predictive modelling. No storms were recorded, no geomagnetic anomalies appeared, and maintenance logs showed no warnings of imminent failure. Even in a remote and volatile environment, the instruments were engineered to endure harsh conditions with minimal oversight. The sudden cessation of readings created not only practical problems for ongoing monitoring, but also a psychological unease, as the absence of data in a station defined by constant observation felt almost unnatural. Emergency protocols were deployed immediately, with technicians running diagnostics, reboots, and manual checks, yet every attempt to restore the data streams failed. Satellite uplinks, backup power sources, and system overrides produced identical results. Nothing registered. Engineers documented each step meticulously, noting environmental conditions and cross-referencing historical trends to identify potential triggers. Their reports emphasized the unprecedented nature of the failure, underscoring that while minor outages had occurred in the past, the scope and simultaneity of this interruption were unlike anything previously recorded in the station's operational history. Historical records show occasional minor outages caused by storms or equipment degradation, but none approached the scale or timing of this unexplained interruption. Past disturbances typically affected one or two instruments at a time, with patterns easily traced to environmental or mechanical causes. In contrast, the Wrangel Island blackout involved multiple systems spanning meteorological, oceanographic, and geophysical monitoring arrays. Analysts who reviewed the event noted that the anomaly persisted long enough to erase a significant window of observational data, leaving researchers with questions about both the reliability of field systems and the potential occurrence of unrecorded environmental events. Despite extreme Arctic conditions, magnetic fluctuations, drifting ice, and sub-zero temperatures, environmental readings at the time of the failure remained within normal operational ranges. Atmospheric sensors indicated no storm fronts, while ocean buoys continued to detect expected tidal movements. The absence of any detectable trigger further deepened the enigma, suggesting that the cause lay either in an undiagnosed systemic issue or an influence entirely outside the scope of standard environmental monitoring. The station, a marvel of precision engineering, was suddenly reduced to a silent grid of unresponsive instruments, its reliability challenged by an unexplained force. Experts considered a range of explanations: software glitches, human error, or electromagnetic interference, yet each hypothesis proved insufficient under scrutiny. Internal reviews confirmed that updates and maintenance had been performed on schedule, and no operator had entered commands that could account for the blackout. External conditions were ruled out after analysis of regional geomagnetic and atmospheric data. Even post-event simulations failed to reproduce the simultaneous failure across multiple, independently functioning devices, leaving investigators with a technical puzzle that resisted both understanding and resolution. The interruption left gaps in long-term monitoring, frustrating ongoing research while fostering an uneasy realization that even the most sophisticated instruments are vulnerable to the unknown. Projects relying on continuous permafrost measurements, ocean current analysis, and wildlife tracking all suffered incomplete records, and scientists were left questioning whether critical events during the outage had gone entirely undocumented. The station continued to operate after the incident, but the shadow of those lost hours lingered, a reminder that the most controlled systems can encounter events beyond prediction and leave traces of mystery in their wake. Although some instruments eventually resumed normal operation, the missing readings could never be reconstructed, leaving an invisible void in the station's continuous record. Researchers catalogued what remained and resumed standard operations, but the anomaly remained officially unresolved, a stark illustration of how extreme isolation and technological dependency can combine to produce a phenomenon that eludes explanation. Even today, the event is cited in Arctic monitoring literature as a rare example of coordinated system interruption with no identifiable cause. The instruments lie dormant, their vanished data a silent testament to forces that no protocol or engineer has yet unravelled. The Faraday Station archive gaps. Rows of meticulously labelled files and bound logbooks filled the shelves of Faraday Station, yet several sections seemed to vanish without explanation, leaving archivists uneasy over unexplained absences. Each folder and ledger had been carefully maintained, documenting daily meteorological readings, solar observations, and instrument calibrations. The station's reputation for rigorous record-keeping made the missing entries all the more conspicuous. Researchers who relied on the station's long-term datasets began noticing inconsistencies when cross-referencing with central archives, realizing that the gaps were not minor clerical errors, but complete absences, striking like voids in the otherwise continuous documentation of decades of Antarctic science. Since its establishment as a hub for meteorological and geophysical studies, Faraday Station had maintained strict protocols for documenting daily operations, ensuring decades of continuous observations under rigorous oversight. Every experiment, instrument calibration, and personnel log was filed according to a meticulous system, creating a body of work intended to withstand scrutiny across generations of scientists. From weather patterns to geomagnetic readings, the station's archives were considered among the most reliable in the Antarctic, a foundation for both national research and international collaboration. Yet within this system of precision, the missing records created a growing sense of unease, suggesting that even the most controlled environments could harbour secrets. Among these records, entire years of key environmental data and mission notes were missing, discovered only when researchers cross-referenced station reports with central archives in the United Kingdom. Scientists noted that the gaps often coincided with periods of unusual activity, such as major solar storms or prolonged instrumentation upgrades, but no documentation explained the omissions. Attempts to locate originals or duplicates yielded nothing, and internal audits failed to identify the source of the losses. The realization that significant portions of the station's operational history could no longer be traced left researchers uncertain about the continuity and reliability of the data they depended on for broader climatological and geophysical analyses. Initial theories suggested simple misfiling or accidental loss during resupply shipments, but closer examination revealed patterns inconsistent with human error, hinting at a more puzzling irregularity. Ship manifests, transfer records, and station inventories confirmed that most material arrived and was processed according to protocol. Yet the same types of documents were absent across multiple years, and even during periods when no resupply mission occurred. The consistency of the omissions suggested either an intentional act or an unknown procedural anomaly, raising questions about what might have been removed and why, in a system otherwise defined by transparency and meticulous control. Personnel who first noticed the gaps described the archival void as disorienting, reporting frustration and a sense of intrusion into an otherwise orderly system of record-keeping. Archivists found themselves retracing steps, revisiting decades of ledger entries and catalogue cards, searching for any hint of what had vanished. Scientists, relying on continuity and measurements, were forced to confront the possibility that events had occurred without documentation, and that conclusions drawn from partial data might be incomplete or misleading. The station's quiet corridors, once defined by methodical routine, now seemed heavy with the weight of missing information, as if the absence itself demanded recognition. The absence of data created tangible consequences, disrupting long-term studies of Antarctic climate trends and leaving scientific analyses incomplete where continuity was essential. Temperature anomalies, solar radiation patterns, and ice thickness measurements were interrupted, leaving statistical gaps that could not easily be interpolated. For climatologists and geophysicists, even minor breaks in long-term series can obscure broader trends, yet these omissions were extensive enough to challenge entire research models. The station's archive, once a bastion of certainty, now exemplified how critical information could quietly disappear, leaving scientists forced to work around the void rather than through it. Efforts to trace missing files included examining transfer logs, cross-checking with secondary repositories, and auditing archival processes, yet the gaps persisted without explanation. Every avenue of investigation reinforced the mystery. Shipments were accounted for, personnel records showed no irregular departures, and no environmental incident could account for the absence. Researchers found themselves relying on fragmentary secondary sources, piecing together partial records while acknowledging that key details may never be recovered. The station's reputation for meticulousness made the loss even more striking, highlighting a rare instance in which institutional precision failed to preserve its own history. Researchers and archivists became aware of the psychological weight carried by missing records, understanding that even the most carefully maintained systems are vulnerable to inexplicable lapses. Scholars reported a creeping sense of unease when encountering the gaps, as if the absence of documentation implied events or decisions deliberately concealed, or lost to some unknowable flaw in archival processes. For staff accustomed to certainty, the realization that parts of the station's operational history were irretrievable introduced a subtle but persistent tension, underscoring that even in an environment devoted to careful observation, human understanding can be incomplete. Faraday Station's archival challenges reverberated across broader Antarctic research networks, prompting caution in interpreting historical datasets while reminding scientists of the fragility of institutional memory. International collaborations relied on continuous and verifiable records, yet the missing entries introduced uncertainty into multi-decadal comparisons, forcing researchers to question not only what was missing, but also what conclusions might be invalidated. The mystery of the absent records became a quiet topic of discussion in academic circles, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unexplained gaps in scientific documentation, even in the most regimented and remote stations. Although records were meticulously maintained and examined for decades, the origin and nature of the missing records remained unresolved, leaving a quiet but persistent uncertainty over the station's historical narrative. Researchers returned to standard operations, yet the archival void remained a reminder that the past, no matter how systematically recorded, can slip beyond reach. The station continued to produce precise observations, but the missing chapters of its own history cast a shadow over the achievements, leaving both staff and scholars with a lingering sense that some truths had quietly been lost. Entire chapters of Faraday Station's past remain inaccessible, their disappearance a reminder that even the most thorough human records can conceal secrets beyond reach. The Svalbard Seed Vault power failure. Deep within the Arctic permafrost, a facility designed to safeguard the world's agricultural heritage experienced a sudden power disruption, leaving engineers and observers questioning how a system built for ultimate reliability could falter. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, often described as humanity's insurance policy against crop loss, operates under near-constant vigilance. Its chambers are maintained at sub-zero temperatures, with multiple independent generators and backup systems designed to ensure uninterrupted preservation. When alarms triggered unexpectedly, the isolated team confronted the unnerving possibility that even the most meticulously designed safety measures could encounter an unforeseen vulnerability, underscoring how fragile human-engineered security can be in extreme conditions. The vault itself is a marvel of engineering, with thick reinforced walls, climate-controlled chambers, and layers of redundancy meant to maintain sub-zero temperatures under any circumstance. Its location, deep inside the permafrost and sheltered by surrounding mountains, allows for natural insulation while minimizing environmental risks. Airlocks, temperature sensors, and emergency power lines form a lattice of interdependent systems, each designed to operate autonomously should others fail. Engineers have long emphasized that the facility's design accounts for extreme Arctic conditions, yet even the most carefully calculated tolerances cannot eliminate the unknown entirely, leaving the staff aware that absolute control is impossible in such an isolated environment. Containing hundreds of thousands of seed samples from nearly every country, the collection represents the foundation of global crop diversity, including varieties that could vanish forever without these precautions. From staple cereals like wheat and rice to rare heirloom seeds, the vault functions as a repository of life, a safeguard against ecological disasters, war, and climate change. Each sample is catalogued, barcoded, and stored within insulated boxes that provide additional protection against temperature fluctuations. The sudden interruption of power threatened not just individual seeds, but the continuity of decades of careful agricultural conservation, emphasizing how even a momentary lapse could ripple through global food security systems. During the incident, critical cooling systems temporarily ceased operation, triggering alarms and forcing staff to assess which circuits and backups had failed, all while environmental conditions outside remained harsh but unremarkable. Sub-zero temperatures outside, combined with natural insulation provided by the permafrost, prevented immediate loss, but any sustained failure could have caused irreversible thawing. The team tracked each sensor, monitoring temperature fluctuations in real time and logging the performance of backup generators as they kicked in. The unusual simultaneity of the alarms suggested a complex multi-layered disruption that was difficult to trace, highlighting the delicate interdependence of automated systems and human oversight. Technicians and engineers followed emergency protocols with precision, activating secondary generators and monitoring each chamber to prevent temperature fluctuations that could compromise the integrity of the seeds. They performed redundant checks of electrical circuits, fuel levels, and automated control systems, aware that a single misstep could worsen an already delicate situation. Communication with outside experts was limited by the station's remote location, placing the onus entirely on the team present to manage both the technical and psychological pressures of the event. Every decision, every adjustment, carried a weight amplified by the isolation and the knowledge that the global scientific community depended on their vigilance. Investigations considered mechanical failure, software glitches, and potential electrical anomalies, yet public statements offered only limited explanations, leaving much of the event shrouded in uncertainty. The vault's operators acknowledged the occurrence in broad terms, emphasizing that no seeds were harmed and that all systems returned to normal. Still, the lack of specific technical detail left observers and agricultural researchers with unanswered questions, heightening the sense of unease that even the most advanced infrastructure can encounter unpredictable setbacks. The incident became a reminder that high-tech systems, no matter how redundant, are never fully invulnerable to unforeseen complications. The momentary failure reverberated beyond the facility, drawing attention from agricultural scientists, policymakers, and the public, all aware that even brief disruptions could carry symbolic weight for global food security. Media outlets reported on the incident with cautious alarm, noting that the seed vault's symbolic significance often eclipses its technical reality. Experts emphasized that while no physical loss occurred, the episode highlighted how dependent global agricultural resilience is on a small number of centralized human-operated systems. Even for the most meticulous observers, the episode introduced a subtle anxiety about the limits of engineered security. The incident highlighted the delicate balance between human engineering and environmental extremes, emphasizing that even the most carefully planned systems remain vulnerable to unforeseen complications. Redundant generators, multiple power lines, and automated alarms form a safety network, yet the potential for simultaneous failure cannot be eliminated entirely. This realization reminded both engineers and the global community that the seed vault, despite its design and reputation, is ultimately a human creation operating in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, where isolation amplifies both risk and responsibility. In response, enhanced monitoring, redundant power checks, and procedural reviews were implemented, though the exact root cause remained officially unresolved. maintaining an air of quiet tension around the facility's operations. Engineers added additional fail-safes, and maintenance protocols were revised to anticipate anomalies, yet the precise mechanism that triggered the simultaneous alerts was never disclosed. The event became a case study in risk management, illustrating how even the most critical systems, designed for redundancy and resilience, retain an element of unpredictability that cannot be fully anticipated. While the vault returned to full functionality and the seeds remained preserved, the episode lingered in institutional memory, a reminder that absolute control in isolated, extreme environments can be an illusion. Staff continue to monitor the facility with heightened awareness, knowing that despite technological safeguards, the unknown remains a constant factor. The incident underscored a simple yet profound truth. Even the most carefully engineered systems cannot fully escape uncertainty, and the preservation of life's genetic diversity rests upon both human diligence and uncontrollable environmental forces. Beneath layers of permafrost and reinforced steel, the seeds endure, their preservation dependent on systems whose limits no engineer has fully mastered. The Ascension Island tracking station silence. A sudden blackout swept across the Ascension Island tracking station, halting satellite communications and leaving operators in a rare and uneasy void of silence. The station, perched on one of the most isolated islands in the South Atlantic, usually functions with remarkable reliability, feeding continuous streams of telemetry data to laboratories and agencies worldwide. When signals abruptly ceased, the silence was immediate and palpable, transforming familiar control rooms into spaces of tense uncertainty. Engineers and technicians, trained for equipment failure, confronted a situation that no protocol had fully anticipated: the absence of contact in a system designed never to pause. The isolation of the island amplified the unease, as there would be no immediate support beyond the personnel present. The station, a vital node in global telemetry networks, monitors satellites in low Earth orbit, providing essential data for navigation, weather observation, and scientific research. Its scope encompasses not only civilian and scientific satellites, but also critical infrastructure relays whose operation depends on timely, precise coordination. Observers outside the station, accustomed to reliable updates, suddenly experienced a delay in incoming telemetry, signaling that the blackout's effects extended far beyond the island itself. Despite decades of refinement and investment in redundancy, the station's sudden lapse demonstrated that even highly controlled systems cannot eliminate all sources of interruption. Staff understood immediately that a single failure here could propagate unforeseen consequences across multiple dependent networks. Antennas, receivers, and multiplex communication systems usually operate in precise synchrony, relaying streams of information continuously to control centers thousands of miles away. Each transmitter is equipped with automatic fail-safes, designed to switch operations between redundant units if a fault occurs. Satellite control routines, orbital adjustments, and calibration sequences are all timed down to the second, making any interruption immediately detectable. Nevertheless, the abrupt interruption suggested a problem that transcended ordinary mechanical or electronic failure, raising questions about how simultaneous systems could falter in concert. Even in a facility designed for extreme reliability, the momentary loss of coordination exposed a rarely acknowledged vulnerability: the station itself as a potential single point of failure. Technicians first recognized the anomaly when routine transmissions failed to arrive, triggering automated alerts that signaled the unusual interruption in otherwise flawless operations. Monitors indicated that not just one, but multiple channels had ceased transmitting, creating a pattern inconsistent with isolated malfunctions. Staff quickly traced data paths, verified power supply stability, and reviewed both automated diagnostics and manual system logs. The absence of an immediate cause introduced a creeping awareness among the team that something in the station's interconnected systems was behaving unpredictably, and that human intuition would be as important as technology in resolving it. Staff immediately initiated emergency protocols, checking power sources, backup transmitters, and satellite alignment while coordinating with nearby observatories to isolate the source of the outage. Engineers toggled redundant circuits, reviewed communication logs, and rerouted data to secondary receivers to maintain continuity wherever possible. The isolated location of the station compounded the challenge. resupply or on-site expert support would not be immediate, placing full responsibility on those present to maintain operations while analysing an anomaly of uncertain origin. Every decision, every adjustment, carried a weight amplified by the awareness that international stakeholders depended on the integrity of this single facility. Initial assessments suggested possible equipment failure, software misconfiguration, or environmental interference, yet each explanation raised further questions as no conclusive cause was identified. Lightning strikes and electromagnetic disturbances were considered and ruled out by both environmental monitoring and post-incident review. The station's software and hardware teams found no internal alerts that corresponded with the disruption, leaving the blackout shrouded in ambiguity. Engineers documented every system check and recalibration, noting anomalies with meticulous care, yet the mystery persisted, highlighting the limits of even the most thorough monitoring. The interruption caused a cascade of missed data, affecting scheduled satellite passes and delaying critical telemetry that other stations relied upon, exposing the fragility of interconnected monitoring networks. Satellite maneuvers, weather observations, and orbital adjustments were temporarily compromised, forcing reliant organizations to adjust schedules and reroute analyses. Some data had to be interpolated or recovered from secondary sources, a reminder that redundancy can mitigate loss but never erase the consequences of silence. While no immediate catastrophe occurred, the episode served as a stark illustration of how even momentary lapses in isolated systems can ripple far beyond their point of origin. Operators described a tension unlike routine alerts, a heightened awareness that a single unexpected silence in an isolated station could ripple across multiple global systems. The hum of running servers and the blinking of indicators, typically reassuring, became markers of anxiety when the usual cadence of signals vanished. Staff alternated between methodical troubleshooting and silent monitoring, aware that the stakes of prolonged failure extended from scientific research to operational decision-making dependent on timely satellite data. The human presence, vigilant and alert, became as crucial as the automated systems that had suddenly paused. Despite rapid recovery, the incident underscored the interdependence of remote installations, revealing how reliant even the most robust networks are on stations that are themselves vulnerable to unknown disruptions. Other observatories continued to function, but the blackout highlighted that no system exists in true isolation. Each link depends on countless unseen and finely tuned connections. Analysts and engineers alike recognized the incident as a reminder of latent fragilities, illustrating the challenge of ensuring seamless global monitoring in a world reliant on increasingly complex technological systems. By the time normal operations resumed, the mystery lingered, leaving engineers and researchers to confront an uncomfortable truth about the gaps that even sophisticated systems cannot always explain. Post-incident reviews confirmed that all equipment was functioning, and subsequent testing showed no persistent faults, yet the precise cause of the blackout remained undetermined. For the staff who witnessed the silence firsthand, the hours of inactivity carried a subtle but lasting impression, the knowledge that even the most reliable networks are subject to moments beyond prediction or control. The event became a quiet lesson in humility and vigilance, emphasizing that technological certainty is never absolute. Though signals flowed once more, the hours of unexplained silence remained, a quiet reminder that even the most advanced networks can harbor secrets beyond observation. The Cape Denison structural incident. Early sensor readings at Cape Denison revealed subtle shifts within the historic station that did not correspond to any immediately apparent environmental cause. The facility, a remnant of the Australasian Antarctic expedition, had withstood over a century of extreme winds and shifting ice, yet the data suggested movement that defied the expectations of even the most precise monitoring. Operators initially questioned the instruments, suspecting calibration errors, but repeated verification confirmed that the vibrations were real. The station, long considered structurally stable, seemed to be responding to forces beyond routine environmental stress, an observation that immediately drew the attention of both engineers and scientists on site. The chill in the air, combined with the constant roar of distant katabatic winds, added a layer of unease to the otherwise methodical investigation. The station, built during the Australasian Antarctic expedition, stands exposed to relentless katabatic winds, its foundations designed to endure decades of ice and snow accumulation. Timber beams and iron supports were constructed with careful consideration of load distribution, yet the Antarctic environment remains unpredictable, and even minor changes in ice compaction or wind velocity can stress materials in unexpected ways. Historical logs suggested that the structure had survived similar conditions for decades without significant incident, making the current readings particularly puzzling. Observers noted that the combination of harsh weather and aging materials created a setting where subtle movements could be easily overlooked or misinterpreted. The constant low temperatures meant that any metal contraction or timber shift could be amplified in ways that sensors could detect more readily than human senses. Embedded instruments recorded vibrations and micro-movements across multiple points of the structure, providing a continuous data stream that hinted at unusual stress patterns. Accelerometers and strain gauges detected minute shifts along the walls and foundation, patterns that did not match either known wind cycles or seasonal temperature fluctuations. The data suggested that the station was flexing in ways that had never been documented, movements imperceptible to the human eye but significant enough to register on sensitive equipment. Engineers began constructing a detailed temporal map of the anomalies, seeking correlations between readings, external conditions, and historical station data. Even minor variations in ice density and snow load were examined for their potential role in influencing the structure. Staff first noted the anomalies while conducting routine inspections, observing slight creaks and displacements that had never been documented before. Floorboards groaned in response to forces that could not be attributed to personnel movement, and window frames appeared marginally askew compared with prior measurements. These subtle indicators, initially dismissed as minor environmental effects, gained significance once the sensor data corroborated their presence. The team, trained to identify early warning signs of structural instability, began treating each anomaly as potentially consequential, aware that the Antarctic environment could amplify even small defects. Even the rhythmic howl of the wind against the station's walls became a reference point for detecting changes in structural response. Immediate efforts involved meticulous measurements and visual surveys, with teams comparing current data to historical logs to isolate potential explanations. Laser rangefinders, leveling equipment, and strain analyses were employed to capture precise dimensions and angles, while prior architectural schematics offered context for interpretation. The complexity of the station's design, combined with its historical modifications, made it difficult to determine which movements were new and which were long-standing. Despite these challenges, the monitoring continued relentlessly, the observers driven by both scientific curiosity and the practical need to preserve the station. Each observation was carefully logged, adding another layer to the growing record of unexplained behaviour. Analysts considered the forces of wind, shifting ice, and foundation settling, yet none of these factors fully accounted for the pattern or intensity of the detected movements. Katabatic gusts, though powerful, followed predictable rhythms, and the ice below the station remained largely stable according to geophysical surveys. Foundation settling was plausible in older structures, but the distribution and timing of the anomalies did not match typical compression patterns. The station, engineered with historical care, appeared to be experiencing movements that existed at the intersection of natural forces and unknown environmental influence, defying simple explanation. Investigators noted that even subtle vibrations seemed amplified in unexpected ways, as if the building itself were reacting independently. Operational planning was affected as engineers debated whether to restrict access to certain sections and implement temporary reinforcement measures while investigations continued. Certain wings of the station, normally accessed for research and maintenance, were cordoned off, and structural sensors were recalibrated at higher frequency. Personnel moved cautiously, aware that the combination of environmental exposure and unexplained stress could present hidden hazards. Planning meetings emphasized caution and monitoring, reinforcing the tension between preserving historical integrity and ensuring human safety. Even minor adjustments to the station's internal layout were approached with care, knowing that each change could influence structural readings. Personnel reported a heightened awareness of the station's subtle sounds and shifts. noting that the interplay of wind and structure created an almost perceptible tension in the air. Even in periods of relative calm, creaks and groans punctuated the stillness, reminding staff that the station was an active participant in the environment rather than a passive shelter. Engineers walked corridors with heightened attention, listening for vibrations and noting any anomalies in floorboards or support beams. The auditory cues complemented the sensor data, providing a holistic understanding of the station's physical behaviour that was impossible to capture in diagrams alone. The anomaly also sparked discussions about how century-old Antarctic buildings interact with modern monitoring equipment, highlighting the limits of human engineering in extreme environments. Instruments designed for precision sometimes revealed phenomena that historical builders could not have anticipated, and yet the station itself, resilient and enduring, continued to function. Researchers considered the balance between observation and interpretation, recognizing that even advanced monitoring systems could not fully account for the dynamic interplay of ice, wind, and structural response. The episode became a case study in the unpredictability of extreme environments interacting with human construction, emphasizing both fragility and endurance. Even after exhaustive evaluation, the cause of the structural irregularities remained unresolved, leaving observers to reconcile the data with the unpredictable forces of nature. The station's movements, while minor and non-threatening, continued to challenge assumptions about structural stability and environmental predictability. Engineers documented the anomalies in detail, yet the precise mechanics behind them remained elusive, a reminder that even well-understood systems can behave unexpectedly under unusual circumstances. Observers left the station with a renewed respect for the delicate balance between human ingenuity and the relentless Antarctic conditions, aware that certainty in such a place is always provisional. Though outward appearances remained unchanged, the station's quiet, persistent movements suggested that the Antarctic could still defy even the most precise human engineering. The Haughton Mars Project Isolation Breakdown. Inside the confined habitat at Haughton Mars, mission participants first noticed minor irregularities that hinted at a disruption in the carefully controlled isolation protocols. The Arctic analogue site, situated on Devon Island in the Canadian High Arctic, is designed to simulate Mars-like conditions with extreme cold, rocky terrain and limited access to external support. Crew members had adapted to the strict schedule of scientific experiments, equipment monitoring and environmental observation, yet small, unexplained events began to disrupt the sense of predictability that structured their daily routine. Initial anomalies seemed trivial, almost imperceptible, but repeated patterns quickly suggested that something was out of alignment with expectations. Days of constant Arctic wind and sub-zero temperatures had created a rhythm of routine, yet the monotony only heightened sensitivity to subtle changes in equipment or environment. The habitat was insulated, but not impervious to the external harshness, and even minor mechanical or electronic fluctuations were felt immediately by attentive participants. Isolated for weeks at a time, crew members became acutely aware of every creak of the structure, every flicker in the lights, and every deviation in temperature readings. The environment itself, both external and internal, amplified the perception of anomalies, transforming otherwise routine operations into sources of scrutiny and unease. Small anomalies appeared in the habitat's monitoring systems, sensor fluctuations, inexplicable power dips, and a few missing entries in the otherwise meticulous logs. Data that should have been consistent showed irregular spikes, while certain instruments recorded values that defied logical explanation. Attempts to replicate the anomalies under controlled conditions proved inconclusive, leaving operators unsure whether they faced a technical fault, human oversight, or something altogether more enigmatic. The precision of the monitoring equipment, designed to capture even minute deviations, only underscored the unusual nature of these disruptions. Crew members compared observations and debated whether the anomalies were technical glitches, human error, or something else entirely, their discussions tinged with growing unease. Questions were raised in hushed tones about the integrity of the instruments, the timing of the irregularities, and the possible influence of environmental factors that had not been accounted for. In a habitat where every detail is documented and analysed, even a minor inconsistency can escalate into a source of tension. The crew's growing attentiveness reflected both professional diligence and the psychological strain inherent in prolonged isolation. Engineers and supervisors examined potential procedural failures, power inconsistencies, and environmental interference, but none of the factors fully accounted for the timing or nature of the breakdown. Backup systems functioned normally, and environmental sensors recorded nothing unusual outside the expected extremes of Arctic weather. Equipment logs were scrutinized line by line, and yet no conclusive cause emerged. The persistence of unexplained readings suggested a phenomenon that straddled the boundary between technical irregularity and human perception, leaving the investigative team with more questions than answers. The confined environment magnified interpersonal tensions, with subtle mistrust, heightened alertness, and minor conflicts adding to the perception that the habitat itself might be responding unpredictably. Crew members reported being unusually aware of one another's movements, second-guessing actions that had previously gone unnoticed. Sleep patterns were affected by the sense that small disturbances could escalate into larger issues, and moments of quiet reflection became punctuated by attention to every sound, light flicker, or mechanical hum. The psychological effect of isolation intensified the mystery, making each anomaly feel more consequential than it might have under ordinary circumstances. In response, the team implemented strict monitoring schedules, cross-checked sensor data, and enforced new logging procedures, attempting to regain a sense of control over their environment. Redundant checks and verification processes were introduced, and responsibilities were rotated to reduce fatigue and human error. Every instrument reading, system adjustment, and behavioral observation was recorded with heightened precision. Despite these measures, the anomalies persisted in subtle ways, appearing intermittently and without predictable pattern, demonstrating that even the most meticulous procedures could not fully account for what was occurring. Even after these measures, unanswered questions persisted. Gaps in records, brief but unexplained system failures, and inconsistencies in the mission's official documentation suggested that not all anomalies had been resolved. Investigators noted that some events were entirely omitted from post-mission summaries, while others were described only in passing. This selective documentation created an incomplete picture, raising speculation about what had truly occurred within the habitat. Observers outside the mission recognized that such gaps were not uncommon in high-stress environments, yet the lack of clarity only intensified the air of mystery surrounding the breakdown. The incident prompted reflection on the limits of human endurance in extreme isolation, illustrating how even well-planned analog missions can harbor subtle and enigmatic disruptions. Researchers considered the ways in which environmental stress, prolonged confinement, and interpersonal dynamics interact in unpredictable ways, producing effects that may never be fully understood. The Arctic simulation, while meticulously controlled, revealed the fragility of human perception and the difficulty of distinguishing between technical anomalies and psychological influences. The mission became a reminder that isolation itself can amplify uncertainty, creating conditions where even minor incidents gain disproportionate significance. Observers and participants alike were left with the impression that the habitat's anomalies might never be fully understood, lingering as a quiet but persistent element of the mission experience. The combination of environmental stresses, system irregularities, and human perception produced a mystery that continued to echo long after the mission concluded. Analyses, reports, and discussions provided partial explanations, but the underlying cause of the isolation breakdown remained elusive. The habitat, designed to simulate extraterrestrial conditions, had revealed an unanticipated reality. Extreme isolation can generate phenomena that resist clear interpretation, leaving both participants and observers unsettled. Even after systems were restored and routines returned to normal, the unexplained events lingered in memory, a subtle reminder that isolation can conceal mysteries no instrument can fully measure. The Rothera Station internal lockdown. The interior of Rothera Station suddenly felt smaller, as if the familiar corridors and workspaces had been transformed by invisible boundaries. Personnel were confined to certain sections, while alarms and protocol alerts quietly engaged, though no explanation accompanied the restrictions. The station, perched on the Antarctic Peninsula, functions as a hub for meteorology, geology, and atmospheric research, housing a combination of laboratories, workshops, and observation decks. Its design usually allows researchers to move freely between these areas, but the internal lockdown created an unusual sense of controlled restriction that seemed at odds with the station's purpose. Even for experienced personnel, trained in emergency procedures and isolation protocols, the confinement was disorienting, highlighting the tension between strict order and sudden uncertainty. Morning routines had begun normally, with scientists measuring snow accumulation, calibrating instruments, and checking communications with other Antarctic stations. The hum of equipment, the rhythmic ticking of environmental sensors, and the soft light filtering through insulated windows created a sense of precision and stability. These routines were punctuated by the quiet mechanical sounds of doors, ventilation systems, and the distant roar of wind against the station's exterior. In this environment, even minor deviations can be noticed immediately, and the first subtle alarms went largely unremarked until the restrictions extended beyond a few minutes. Indicators on control panels flickered, some displaying messages that resembled routine procedural notifications, yet their timing did not align with any planned drills. Staff initially assumed a software test or brief anomaly in the alarm system, but as the messages persisted and access points remained sealed, the sense of normalcy began to dissolve. Lights on doors blinked in a sequence that staff had never encountered, and the usually predictable hum of monitoring equipment seemed almost intrusive. Researchers began to realize that this was not a scheduled test, and that something beyond technical oversight had triggered the lockdown. Personnel moved carefully through the station, consulting each other quietly and checking the status of systems, yet no external explanation was forthcoming. Supervisors attempted to correlate the alerts with established emergency protocols, referencing manuals and past incident procedures. Conversations were cautious, deliberate, and tinged with unease. Staff exchanged observations and notes while simultaneously maintaining professional poise. The sense of being watched, either by the station itself or by some unseen authority, permeated the confined spaces, though it was unclear whether it stemmed from human psychology or from the anomalous conditions themselves. A technical review of the station's systems revealed no discernible failure. All power supplies operated within nominal parameters, communications channels remained active, and sensors registered expected environmental values. Backup systems were fully functional, and repeated diagnostics offered no explanation for the lockdown sequence. Even seemingly trivial discrepancies, such as minor delays in door sensor logs, failed to clarify the source of the restriction. Each verified system highlighted the lack of explanation, reinforcing the impression that this event existed outside normal operational understanding. The psychological impact on staff grew as minutes stretched into hours. Corridors normally alive with activity became silent, save for the occasional footstep or the low hum of equipment. Conversations were whispered, gestures were restrained. Researchers reported heightened sensitivity to sound and movement, noting subtle echoes or vibrations that would normally go unnoticed. The isolation created by the lockdown was unlike any prior experience, blending the stress of confinement with the uncertainty of an unexplained event, leaving personnel hyper-aware of the station itself as a space that seemed suddenly alive with ambiguity. Efforts to restore normal operations involved meticulous verification of internal systems and repeated procedural checks. Access points were manually tested, environmental controls cross-checked, and redundant security protocols engaged to confirm operational integrity. Despite these methodical steps, the origin of the lockdown remained opaque, revealing a subtle tension between human control and system unpredictability. Staff followed every instruction precisely, yet the anomaly resisted all attempts at explanation, underscoring the limits of preparedness in remote and extreme environments. Historical records of station lockdowns offered little insight into the event. While Antarctic facilities occasionally implement temporary restrictions for safety drills, environmental hazards, or security reasons, none match the duration, timing, or unexplained nature of this incident. Personnel familiar with such protocols recognized the anomaly as unusual, and even archival documentation failed to provide precedents that could clarify the situation. The episode stood out as a rare and puzzling internal event, one that blurred the lines between procedural control and enigmatic circumstance. Inconsistencies between staff recollections and official reports deepened the mystery. Logs were incomplete in places, timestamps conflicted, and certain observations were omitted from post-event summaries. Interviews conducted afterward revealed variations in how personnel remembered sequences of events, further complicating any attempt at a coherent narrative. The partial documentation suggested that some aspects of the lockdown had either been overlooked, deemed irrelevant, or deliberately left ambiguous, leaving researchers and observers alike with questions that would never be fully answered. Gradually, the station returned to its normal operational rhythm. Laboratory work resumed, communications were fully restored, and the flow of daily activity returned to a predictable cadence. Yet the memory of the unexplained confinement lingered among staff, colouring their perception of ordinary events with subtle wariness. Even routine tasks were now performed with heightened attention, a quiet acknowledgement that the station had temporarily operated under conditions outside comprehension, and that no protocol, no system check, and no report could fully account for what had occurred. The station returned to normal operation, yet the cause of the internal lockdown remained unresolved, a quiet puzzle that no report or observation could fully explain. The DOMA transmission anomaly. Signals of unknown origin flickered across DOMA's monitoring systems, startling scientists who had grown accustomed to the station's constant but predictable electronic hum. The station itself consisted of modular insulated structures, linked by narrow corridors, each carefully maintained against the crushing cold of East Antarctica. Situated at the highest point of the plateau, Dome provided near-perfect isolation, its extreme altitude and distance from human activity rendering it one of the most challenging environments for scientific observation. Instruments designed to detect cosmic rays, atmospheric shifts, and geophysical vibrations operated with precision unparalleled elsewhere, yet the appearance of these signals defied all known patterns. Fleeting, irregular, and entirely unclassifiable, the transmissions immediately set the researchers on edge. Amid layers of instrumentation tracking atmospheric and geophysical data, the crew began to notice subtle discrepancies suggesting that the anomaly was not random noise. Oscilloscopes and radiospectrometers recorded faint, almost deliberate spikes, while other detectors logged corresponding disturbances. Even the most sensitive antenna arrays designed to filter out cosmic or terrestrial interference could not dismiss the pulses. Each reading, no matter how carefully cross-checked, pointed to a signal that had no natural or human explanation. The researchers began to log every detail meticulously, aware that in this remote setting every observation could prove vital. A sudden cluster of high-frequency pulses erupted across multiple channels, each brief sequence defying patterns associated with cosmic radiation or known interference. The bursts lasted only seconds but appeared in perfect synchronicity across independent instruments, a feature that heightened their strangeness. Initial speculation suggested atmospheric anomalies or minor electrical faults, yet the extreme isolation and controlled environment of the station eliminated these possibilities. Even as the cold wind whipped across the plateau outside, no environmental factor could account for signals recorded simultaneously by disparate systems. Efforts to trace the source involved cross-checking every external communication line, satellite feed, and internal device, yet the anomaly remained unmatched by any known signal. Logs from other Antarctic stations and global satellite telemetry were examined, revealing no correlation. Researchers attempted to simulate the signals using onboard generators and software routines, but every reproduction failed. Each failure reinforced the notion that these transmissions belonged to an entirely unexplored domain, a phenomenon resistant to conventional scientific explanation. Outside, the Antarctic plateau stretched in stark white isolation, temperatures plunging past -80 degrees Celsius, emphasizing the fragility of both human observation and technology in such extremes. The relentless wind scoured the ice, while sunlight reflected off the unbroken expanse with a glare that could overwhelm the eyes. Within this vast silence, the transmissions took on a spectral quality, faintly echoing in the minds of the crew as they moved through insulated corridors. The emptiness beyond the station amplified the sense that something beyond their comprehension was subtly interacting with the instruments. Sporadic repetitions of the pulses occurred over the following hours, varying slightly in amplitude, duration, and pitch, frustrating all attempts at pattern recognition. Each recurrence was carefully logged, with timestamps, frequency data, and waveform diagrams compiled for later review. Yet despite the detailed records, no consistent pattern emerged. The signals seemed to follow rules known only to themselves, resisting attempts to classify them within any known physical or electronic framework. The anomaly grew more mysterious with each pulse. Straining to capture more subtle variations, the team began comparing the anomaly with other rarely observed electromagnetic phenomena, including sub-auroral signals and deep space radio bursts, yet none of these matched the patterns recorded at Dome A. Even the timing of the pulses resisted correlation with solar wind activity or geomagnetic fluctuations, leaving researchers increasingly aware that the anomaly might represent a category of signal entirely outside existing catalogues. Each new dataset, meticulously annotated, revealed additional irregularities, micro-fluctuations within the pulses themselves that suggested complexity beyond ordinary natural or technical sources. The station's isolation magnified every uncertainty, as the researchers realized that the anomaly existed in a domain where conventional rules seemed to falter. Debate among the researchers intensified, reflecting the limits of both instrumentation and interpretation. Some proposed auroral interference as a possible source, citing minor solar activity, while others suspected subtle software or calibration artifacts. A few considered the possibility of an entirely new type of atmospheric or electromagnetic phenomenon, one not previously recorded. Meetings extended late into the station's artificial night, as the hum of generators and flickering instrument panels underscored the tension between caution and curiosity. Logs recorded only fragmented details, partial waveforms, cryptic annotations, and corrupted timestamps that made reconstruction nearly impossible. Analysts attempted to reconcile environmental events with the signals, but gaps persisted. Comparing the data to previous year's recordings revealed no precedent, and even archived logs from nearby stations offered no clarification. The anomaly existed in fragments, a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit neatly together. Attempts to replicate the signals with coordinated observation from neighbouring stations produced inconsistent or null results. Satellites and distant receivers offered no confirmation, while simulations repeatedly failed to match the pulse characteristics. The phenomenon resisted both human replication and predictive modelling, emphasising the extraordinary limits of scientific control in extreme isolation. Instruments recorded faithfully, yet comprehension lagged behind observation, leaving a sense of disquiet that permeated both the station and the minds of those who staffed it. Hours later, routine monitoring resumed, but the memory of the signals lingered like a faint vibration through every system. Researchers returned to scheduled observations, environmental maintenance and data analysis, yet awareness of the unexplained anomaly persisted. Even familiar tasks felt subtly altered, every electronic hum or faint pulse of the instruments serving as a reminder that some phenomena in the Antarctic plateau lay beyond detection, explanation or expectation. The anomaly had receded but left its imprint, a quiet tension threading through the station's frozen corridors. Even after meticulous verification, the transmissions lingered in uncertainty, a ghostly rhythm across the ice that no calculation, theory or instrument could fully capture.